Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
It was a sunny April. Spring is always associated with the beginning of new life. All people were looking forward to it this year because March was cold and the awakening of nature was delayed. But the news of this month amazed everyone. Everywhere in the newspapers, on TV and radio, they were talking about only one thing. Everyone from old grandmothers at the doorstep to pigeons flying over Washington was talking about this news. The Capitol was stunned by this event, and everything revolved around a famous businessman who decided to get married. But it would not have struck anyone if not for one strange circumstance. He had many marriages with stars, but this time it was different. The girl was a complete stranger to no one. No one knew her name or even her appearance. All the newspapers had a question mark drawn instead of her face. The media kept him on his toes. They kept watch over him day and night in the hope that when he came out, he would at least clear the air. Martin Newman was one of the most famous businessmen in the world. His company developed games, made a sensation years ago, and was still the main one on the market. He was loved by everyone from 15-year-old teenagers to men in their 40s. Of course, there were also girls among the audience, but still the majority of the audience were men who liked to play war games at the computer. Martin was known for his personal life to almost everyone. He'd been married to 3 celebrities from abroad, but now he'd surprised everyone. To marry someone unknown to any living soul seemed strange and irrational. No one knew who this mysterious girl was, who was so zealously hidden in his mansion. But where there is intrigue and mystery, there's interest. Society needs these mysteries. That's why this wedding was eagerly awaited by everyone. One journalist managed to get as close as possible to his house, bypassing the 3 guards at the gate. The house was, of course, outside the city. The businessman tried to solve almost all cases remotely, but it was a very dodgy reporter who, unfortunately, also failed. When Martin was leaving his house to get into his car, the reporter jumped out of the bushes and ran at him with all his legs. But he was immediately stopped by the guards. One of the thugs wanted to threaten the poor guy with a gun. He started to pull it out of his pocket, but Martin stopped him. "Let him through." "I will quickly answer," in a stern tone, the businessman told his guard. He obeyed and stepped back. The journalist immediately realized what he was doing and quickly pulled out a camera and a microphone. "Can you tell me the name of your fiancée? Just the name, please." Martin hesitated for a moment, as if he wanted to understand whether to answer or not. But he decided to answer. "Her name is Agatha," he said, barely grinned enigmatically, and got into a car with tinted windows. The very next day, it was all over the news channels and newspapers. The world knew the name. And again, the discussion of the wedding, which was scheduled for May 15, began. Everyone was waiting for this event. Wanted to at least somehow get information about where the wedding of a famous businessman will be held. What guests are invited? Where will they go on their honeymoon? But Martin and his agents were silent. All questions of journalists remained unanswered. Only sometimes on the face of the businessman could be seen a slight smirk when he was asked about the bride. This only fueled the interest of the public. At the presentation of the new project, Martin, unfortunately, flooded with questions not about the purpose of his activities, but about marriage. He was beginning to tire of it. In the midst of the siege, which was arranged by journalists, the businessman made a sign to everyone with his hand to wait a minute and leaned over to his manager. Quietly asked him something. How could the reporters not strain their ears? They couldn't hear anything. The question was, what if she wakes up? Martin asked the manager he trusted like his mother. "Those are strong drugs." "Nothing will happen," he replied and winked at the chief. Finally, the cherished day arrived. The wedding was decided to be held in the very center. People crowded around the fence instead, trying to get a glimpse of the bride and groom. And then, accompanied by 3 escort cars, a Maybach with tinted windows drove up to Max. People were almost throwing themselves at the car, trying to see who was sitting there. But they failed miserably. They were dragged away by law enforcement. There was a commotion and a crush. After a few minutes, a Polak Martin got out of the car. He did not even look back and immediately went to the door of the registry office. But he was stopped by a photographer who pointed to the bride. He wanted to take a picture of them at the registry office. Happy and full of hope for a bright future. "You will only take pictures of what I say," rudely replied Martin. He pushed the guy away and entered the building, and the audience watched the bride's exit. But even here, they had no luck. The driver opened the door and helped the girl in the white dress stand up. As soon as the light fell on her face, everyone screamed with delight. Immediately, the discussion began. "Oh my God, she's so young. She must be marrying him for his money." They were talking in the crowd. "It's obvious she's a kept woman." Others responded. Amid all the shouting and yelling, the bride walked towards the building. She was accompanied by a guard with black glasses. She held onto his arm as if she feared she would fall. They walked very slowly. Someone in the crowd immediately said that she was handicapped, and everyone picked up on that. There were 1,000 cameras pointed at the poor girl. Everyone wanted to capture her face and her gait. The media was at the forefront of capturing every little detail to create new gossip. The public had to be fed new content, bread and spectacle. The motto of ancient Rome is always relevant, and the tabloids are doing a great job of it. Finally, the bride entered the registry office and the shouts of the crowd were left behind. Before her opened a stunning view of the high ceilings, framed, gilded stucco. At the top, a painting depicting angels could be seen. Everything suggests it's a place of peace. But the bride didn't feel that way. She felt rather strange in general. This was noticed by the guests as well. They also managed to notice her incredible beauty. The girl was very slender and young. In appearance, she was not more than 25. Among the guests on the groom's side were his colleagues or some influential people in business. On the bride's side, there were only 2 bridesmaids who were sitting on chairs and chatting. Everyone was waiting for the ceremony to begin. This bride was acting very strangely, not talking to anyone. "She's standing in the corner looking down at the floor. After all, it's her wedding," said one of the guests of the celebration. It was a woman named Lily, who also had a similar company. Only they developed games not for computers, but for mobile devices. And they have the right audience. Mostly people over 50 and don't talk. Rumor has it that this is the model he brought back from Australia. She doesn't know the language. Maybe that's why she doesn't talk to anyone and acts so quiet, her neighbor replied. "Really?" Another woman joined the conversation. "I'm sure it's his niece, maybe even his cousin. He's had feelings for her for a long time. But with his parents alive, of course, he couldn't marry her. It would be a disgrace. And now that his parents are dead, he can finally do it. How awful." Lily marveled. "And where did you get this information?" "I have my own connections," answered about the woman Morris. She just explained to them the origin of this girl, and they do not believe her. What kind of outrage is this? What if the groom himself approached them? "Oh, dear Martin, it's so good to see you at last," Lily exclaimed, shaking his hand. "Good afternoon. It's very nice to see you all here as my guests. I hope everything is satisfactory. Of course. We were just discussing you. We're so happy for you. But Martin, tell me, why the secrecy?" One of the women laughed. "Will you never reveal your girlfriend's identity to us?" "I'm madly in love with her," the businessman exclaimed sharply. It was as if he had rehearsed this phrase for a long time. That's why it sounded a bit fake. "So as soon as I met her, I decided to make her my wife." "I hope the bride doesn't mind," the other woman joked. Martin looked at her strangely and without replying, walked away with his head held high. As if the phrase he had just said offended him very much. They were a strange couple, Lily summed up. Rumors were going from extreme to extreme. But the fact was the fact. The girl was unknown to anyone. She had come from nowhere. No one had ever seen her around Martin. No one knew how long they had been dating. Absolutely nothing was known. That's why the news of the wedding made the whole community so excited. It was a real sensation. It was Agatha who was too mysterious. She hadn't uttered a word since she got out of the car. No one knew what her voice was like. Was it melodious or rough? And how old was she? She looked very young. And she was marrying a man who turned 55 this year. All of this didn't connect in my head. While everyone was whispering and talking, waiting for the ceremony to begin, Agatha was led out of the hall to the right into the corridor. There they dragged her into a room, sat her in front of a mirror, and began to put her makeup in order. She was working right in the car. So correct me, that's all. In 15 minutes, the ceremony will begin, said Agent Martin, and left the room, leaving the girls alone. Agatha was not feeling well. She saw everything through a veil, as if she were in a dream. She stared at the mirror for a long time, trying to remember something. It was as if those facial features were alien to her. Her own face was not like her real one. She was like she was in a trance. The makeup artist did her amazing makeup and then put on a veil to cover her face. Like, "Baby, you're ready," smiled the makeup artist. "I hope you really love him." Badoma. And Agatha was pushed towards the door. She completely lost her bearings and didn't know where to go. But she knew the guard was guarding her at the door. He led the girl back to the hall where the ceremony was to be held. Agatha was literally pushed onto the white carpet, studded with rose petals. She almost collapsed on the floor. What amazed the guests. But the girl immediately recovered and, under the melodious music, went down the aisle with flowers. All eyes at this moment were directed at her. Many were judging. Many pretended to be happy, though no one, by and large, cared. They'd been invited here as a courtesy. Well, and to fill the hall is not good that a famous businessman is left without guests at the wedding. Agatha had time to look around the hall. There were people in black on every corner. They all folded their arms and stood like real guards waiting for an attack. Finally, the girl came to the altar. Martin was already waiting for her there. He stood with a very serious look and from time to time slightly bent his knees from excitement. Agatha stood opposite him. At that moment she felt dizzy, but she did not show it. "Hello, honored guests." "Hello, dear newlyweds." The woman greeted the guests, registering the marriage. "Especially the husband is very young," joked one of the guests, but he was immediately silenced. The others ignored the ridiculous joke. Today is the legal marriage of couples whose love has struck a chord with many. The registrar continued. "Dear Agatha and Martin," she addressed the couple standing next to her. "Today is the most beautiful and unforgettable event in your life. Today you are creating a young family. Creating a family is the beginning of a good union of two loving hearts. From this day you will go through life hand in hand, together experiencing the joys of happy days and sorrows. Observing the solemn rites before the state registration of marriage. Please answer, is your desire to be married? Is it free, mutual, and sincere? Are you ready not only to create a friendly and strong family, but also to preserve it and give a decent upbringing to your future children? I ask you to answer." "Groom." The man, not thinking long, took Agatha's hands and looking into her eyes said, "Yes, I ask you to answer bride." The girl turned to Agatha. The bride was embarrassed. All this seemed to her like a strange dream. In her memory flashed some fragments of the past, which confused her very much. She saw neither her chosen one nor her fiancé in the world, but under his intense, heavy gaze. She nevertheless answered in a zombified voice. "Yes," the registrar smiled happily and then proceeded to perform her duties by your mutual consent in the presence of your witnesses and guests. Please exchange rings and sign your signatures." Martin gently took Agatha's hand and placed the gold ring on her ring finger. The bride did the same. The registrar just stepped back and pointed them to the papers. Lying on a beautiful marble table, a black pen lay next to them. "Now sign your signatures," joyfully exclaimed the woman. The couple bent over the deed book. But suddenly from behind there was the sound of a door opening, and then someone's swift running. Everyone turned around, including the newlyweds, and they saw a little girl who ran across the hall so fast that the guard could not catch up with her. The child ran to the reception desk and hugged Agatha tightly. She did not understand anything. Meanwhile, the girl hugged her tightly as if she had found her long-lost mother. "Security," Martin shouted. "Do your job." Huge men in black suits ran up to the girl and began to chain her away from the bride. The girl resisted. She was small, about 6 years old at most, but impossibly strong and a mom. "That's my mom." The girl screamed as hard as she could, struggling against these men in black glasses. One she kicked with her foot in the groin, and he immediately fell to his knees in pain. The other was pulling her legs. So the girl just jerked her foot, and the man fell with her shoe. "Mommy, wake up, it's me." "Your daughter," Mommy broadcast the girl, asking for the girl in the dress. "Please, Mommy Olekshka, remember me." She was trying to remember something, but she couldn't do anything. She didn't recognize that girl, no matter how much she wanted to. There was no way she could remember. Then the child pulled her white dress up so the bride leaned over and hugged her tightly around the neck and kissed her cheek. That kiss, like a fairy tale, dispelled all the fog. The woman's memory began to clear. Agatha was now completely sure that this was her daughter. To think it was her Rose, her baby girl. Where had she come from? Who are all these people? She looked at her pseudo-fiancé. He was standing there furious. He was burning with anger. His fingers were clenched into a fist. It was like he was about to punch someone. As soon as all the memories came flooding back, tears flowed from Agatha's eyes. She squatted down and hugged her daughter tightly. "Little Rose is my darling." It was a very tender moment, which unfortunately was interrupted by the bass of Martin's guard removing the baby. The guards had already recovered from the baby girl's marriage and started pulling her away again. This time they managed to snatch the baby out of the mother's hands. The girl yelled, "What is the urge?" tried to break free, but everything was to no avail. Who is she against, these huge thugs? "Let go of my child." Screaming at Agatha, "Somebody please call the police." All the guests were just shocked at what was happening. Like the marriage registrar herself in her experience, this was the first marriage that had gone completely wrong. "Rose," Agatha screamed, but no one was doing anything about it. Then she jumped up to her fiancé and started shaking him as hard as she could, clutching at his shoulder. "Will you order them to let them go, Rose Ashole?" The girl hissed angrily. "You shouldn't call me that." "Oh, you shouldn't." With a sly smirk, Martin. He pushed his wife away, and she fell right on top of the guard, who immediately grabbed her. No matter how much she kicked, it was completely pointless. Martin's bodyguard held her firmly in his arms. What kind of lawlessness was this? Did the guests start to get indignant and get up from their seats? "No one is leaving here." Martin shouted across the room. The wedding continues. The guests ignored him. No one was enjoying the show anymore. It smelled fried, but a sudden gunshot made them stop and sit back in their seats. Yes, Martin had to resort to this method of crowd control as well. I repeat, the wedding is in progress. He glared at Shu's terrified registrar and made her put the papers back. Then he beckoned to himself, who forcefully held Agatha down. She was terrified of what was happening. She was sobbing with fear and hatred. Martin signed the document and handed the pen to the bride. She looked at the man with such hatred that he even smirked, thinking that he had won. But he was very wrong. Agatha was not the timid type, not one to give up so easily. She picked up a pen, but instead of using it to make a scrawl on the paper, sharply stuck the thin rod into the stomach of the guard who was holding her. The pen was expensive steel, and so thin, it actually went into that piece of muscle like a sword. The man shrieked in pain and folded himself in half. Agatha ripped off her veil, slashed the man who was holding her poor child across the face with her fist, grabbed Rose by the arm and ran away on her way, managing to tear off the hem of her fairy dress. Running was now comfortable. Whirlwind, she ran out of the building, and 1,000 cameras were immediately pointed at her and her daughter. Reporters, like animals, pounced on the girl with questions. Everyone was shocked by the scene in front of them. "Agatha, what happened? How do you comment on it?" someone asked. The girl was darting from side to side, trying to figure out where the exit from the registry office was. Martin's men were already running out and trying to catch her. She was screaming, asking people for help, but everyone just filmed her on their mobile cameras and iPads, trying to take as many photos and videos of the scandal as possible. She felt like a circus animal that was now performing in the arena. The girl couldn't believe what was happening. She just couldn't get her head around it. Why do people behave like this? And this very head was hurting more and more every minute. But the girl did not give up and wanted to climb over the temporary fence. But then the guard Martin grabbed her by the waist. He easily lifted her as if she weighed as much as a bruise, and carried her and the baby to the car. Agatha squealed, slapping him on the back. Rose was biting and turning and generally helping as best she could. But the man didn't care. He was walking firmly and confidently. The back door of the car had already been opened in front of him. As the guard approached the car, he threw the girl and child off him and pushed her into the passenger compartment. But Agatha, though seemingly weak, actually had good physical fitness. She did not fall on the seat and held on. Then the already angry guard began to literally shove her into the cabin. She resisted with all her might. Suddenly, everyone heard sirens wailing. It was getting closer and closer. And then someone said on the loudspeaker, "No place. Everybody stay in your seats." Aha! Saw a cop pushing a security guard away from Martin. Looks like somebody called the cops after all. The guard was outraged by this behavior, but obeyed and stepped back to them. A furious Martin came running up. He was just furious and looked at everyone with such a look, as if he wanted to spear everyone with his eyes. What's going on here? How dare you invade another part of the territory? He was indignant, addressing the policeman. We're here on a call, and I can see that we did not come in vain. The sergeant replied confidently, "Do you have any idea who I am? Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" Martin kept yelling. Then the policeman was silent for a moment. It was like he realized his mistake. "I'm sorry, but I just needed to already," less confidently said the policeman. "What to ruin my wedding? Please understand, I'm just doing my duty." While the two were trying to work things out, Agatha kicked out between the guard and them and went unnoticed. Thanks to the police car, there was a hole in the partition. It was through it that the girl wanted to get through. She took her daughter and rushed to the fence. She almost reached the gap through which it was possible to get through, but she was stopped by someone's strong male hand, which laid on her shoulder. She turned around and saw a rather young policeman, a regular sergeant in his uniform. "Where are you going, citizen?" he asked her sternly. Though from his lips it was not scary, but rather funny. He was a very nice man who tried to portray himself as a serious and brave fighter. He was very young. He had probably just been hired for the job. Agatha stopped. You looked at him with pitying eyes and whispered, "Please let go. I can't let you do that." The sergeant answered confidently. "But don't you feel sorry for a poor mother with a small child in her arms? Do you really want to give us to the sharks?" "What sharks?" "The girl?" The policeman replied haughtily. "Please." She folded her hands in peace. "He will ruin me and my daughter too." Then the sergeant couldn't stand it any longer. At last, the mask of a serious and self-confident man came off. Now only sympathy could be seen on his face. Agatha did not interfere and took advantage of this moment and put her daughter next to her. She approached the boy and whispered softly in his ear, "I'm going to pretend to use violence against a police officer." The sergeant even pulled away from her. He was embarrassed by the tone with which she said it. He looked at her. Agatha looked like a puppy, praying for help. The policeman stood in silence for a few seconds, then nodded, and while Martin and the other sergeant sorted out their rights, Agatha pretended to resist, threw herself into the policeman's arms, and began to thrash as hard as she could. He played along, trying to hold on. Everyone turned around at their altercation. And noticing this, the girl knocked the poor sergeant in the stomach with a sharp heel. He collapsed to the floor, though it was clear from his face that he was in no pain at all. He was only feigning pain. Agatha was very happy about this, as she didn't want to hurt anyone. At this time, a backup in the form of the surgeon's colleague was already running towards them. He ran up to his partner and helped him up. A few seconds later, Agatha was tied up by two other policemen, and her daughter Rose was taken by the hand and led away. The situation was heating up. Martin finally approached them. "Let my fiancée go," he ordered in a tone that left no room for disobedience. It should be noted that although he was a powerful man, but he was not lucky with his height. He was only 165 centimeters tall, and the commands from his mouth sometimes sounded very funny, especially when he was addressing a tall or clean-cut guy like this policeman. If any of his subordinates let his short stature be mentioned in any way, he would be immediately fired or stripped of his bonus. Martin hated that flaw in himself. Fortunately, for him, money did the job, and everyone, by and large, cared only about the size of his wallet. And now the answer of one of the policemen made him terribly angry. No, it wasn't said in words. It was just that one of the policemen, who kept his hands, richly tied, laughed. Then Martin came up to him and hissed through his teeth with an angry look, threatening him with his finger. "You're laughing, asshole. You're laughing." Then the policeman immediately removed the smile from his face. He caught the murderous stare of his superior. "I'm going to fire the hell out of this place," Martin shouted, waving his arms. Quickly they let her go. A mustachioed senior outfitter approached him, holding the serious Rose by the arm. "I'm going to ask you to calm down." Martin calmly said he know the situation is not easy, but your frustrated wife hit one of our employees. She'll have to come with us. This is outrageous. You know who I am. And you dare take my fiancée out of my wedding because she got drunk and accidentally hit one of your employees. See, that's how you want it. We're taking the girl to the station, just like her daughter. You can come in and post bail afterward to clarify the circumstances. All in accordance with applicable law. Please understand us too. Martin at first pouted his lips like a little child and then looked back at the incident with people looking at it from all sides. Thousands of cameras pointed at him, and now he was losing in this story. What kind of headlines would be in the papers? God, it's not hard to imagine. But the journalists would make something worthwhile out of it. Then Martin turned angrily back to the police chief. "Are you going to pay for this?" He said, stopping at every word. "And you?" He pointed at Agatha. "A terrible fate awaits you. Don't even think about getting rid of me." "Understood." Agatha looked at him with horror on her face and a hint of playfulness. She thought that she had won, that everything would be all right at last. How was she wrong? "When?" "Take her away," the irascible businessman asked impatiently. "Tomorrow morning," replied the warden, filling out some paperwork. Martin took a few steps away. He took one last look at these people who were taking his fiancée away and spat on the asphalt. Meanwhile, the clouds thickened and it began to rain. Many spectators began to disperse. The die-hard ones remained, eager for the story to continue. But they were quickly disappointed because Martin got into his car and drove away. Yep, put her in a police car too, and put her daughter in another, and they too departed. And Haji was lucky. She was sitting handcuffed in a car with this sergeant on duty, who helped her act out the whole thing. It was amazing. You have the right to remain silent, of course. A policeman has broken the silence. But I still risk to ask you, what did you want to marry forcibly? Agatha was a little embarrassed by such a question a couple of hours ago. She didn't even know the answer to it. She didn't know who she was, how she got here, how old she was. She didn't know anything, and that scared her terribly. But when Rose appeared, everything changed. It was as if her mind had sobered. She could think straight now, but still she didn't want to trust anyone yet. Trust had been eroded long ago. It was impossible to tell her story to a random person because everyone might not be who they seemed before. I started her even though I had no idea what to say. It's just been quite some time since the policeman asked that question. Yes, you're absolutely right. The thing is, my aunt wanted me to marry a wealthy man. And then this Martin Newman came along. I know he's given me the rest of my life, but I can't marry a man I don't love. And may I say, have you seen him at all? Yeah, he's a pimply old despot, God forbid. The sergeant laughed. He seemed to have exactly the same impression of the businessman. It's a case of take it or leave it, the guy said. Some people want money and fame, and some need simple family happiness. You are a young girl, but you already have a child, and certainly not from this despot. So whose girl is it? My husband. The girl answered thoughtfully. She was trying to come up with a true story. He died in an accident. I was only pregnant at the time. So you are a single mother? The girl nodded affirmatively. The driver saw it through the rearview mirror. "I'm going to fire the hell out of this place," Martin shouted, waving his arms. Quickly they let her go. A mustachioed senior outfitter approached him, holding the serious Rose by the arm. "I'm going to ask you to calm down." Martin calmly said he know the situation is not easy, but your frustrated wife hit one of our employees. She'll have to come with us. This is outrageous. You know who I am. And you dare take my fiancée out of my wedding because she got drunk and accidentally hit one of your employees. See, that's how you want it. We're taking the girl to the station, just like her daughter. You can come in and post bail afterward to clarify the circumstances. All in accordance with applicable law. Please understand us too. Martin at first pouted his lips like a little child and then looked back at the incident with people looking at it from all sides. Thousands of cameras pointed at him, and now he was losing in this story. What kind of headlines would be in the papers? God, it's not hard to imagine. But the journalists would make something worthwhile out of it. Then Martin turned angrily back to the police chief. "Are you going to pay for this?" He said, stopping at every word. "And you?" He pointed at Agatha. "A terrible fate awaits you. Don't even think about getting rid of me." "Understood." Agatha looked at him with horror on her face and a hint of playfulness. She thought that she had won, that everything would be all right at last. How was she wrong? "When?" "Take her away," the irascible businessman asked impatiently. "Tomorrow morning," replied the warden, filling out some paperwork. Martin took a few steps away. He took one last look at these people who were taking his fiancée away and spat on the asphalt. Meanwhile, the clouds thickened and it began to rain. Many spectators began to disperse. The die-hard ones remained, eager for the story to continue. But they were quickly disappointed because Martin got into his car and drove away. Yep, put her in a police car too, and put her daughter in another, and they too departed. And Haji was lucky. She was sitting handcuffed in a car with this sergeant on duty, who helped her act out the whole thing. It was amazing. You have the right to remain silent, of course. A policeman has broken the silence. But I still risk to ask you, what did you want to marry forcibly? Agatha was a little embarrassed by such a question a couple of hours ago. She didn't even know the answer to it. She didn't know who she was, how she got here, how old she was. She didn't know anything, and that scared her terribly. But when Rose appeared, everything changed. It was as if her mind had sobered. She could think straight now. But still, she didn't want to trust anyone yet. Trust had been eroded long ago. It was impossible to tell her story to a random person because everyone might not be who they seemed before. I started her even though I had no idea what to say. It's just been quite some time since the policeman asked that question. Yes, you're absolutely right. The thing is, my aunt wanted me to marry a wealthy man. And then this Martin Newman came along. I know he's given me the rest of my life, but I can't marry a man I don't love. And may I say, have you seen him at all? Yeah, he's a pimply old despot, God forbid. The sergeant laughed. He seemed to have exactly the same impression of the businessman. It's a case of take it or leave it, the guy said. Some people want money and fame, and some need simple family happiness. You are a young girl, but you already have a child, and certainly not from this despot. So whose girl is it? My husband. The girl answered thoughtfully. She was trying to come up with a true story. He died in an accident. I was only pregnant at the time. So you are a single mother? The girl nodded affirmatively. The driver saw it through the rearview mirror. It seemed to him that a tear rolled down her cheek, but he didn't think it was necessary to pay much attention to it. The girl had an overabundance of emotion. It was an understandable reaction. Besides, in a couple of hours her stories and face would be all over the news channels. What kind of scandal would play out? But that would come later. And now they were driving under a passport gray sky, which mourned all the sorrows of the day. By the way, you have not introduced yourself, informed the girl with some semblance of a smile. After a few minutes of silence, Tim also with a smile answered the guy he clearly liked where this dialogue leads. The girl only nodded. She did not give her name. So the surgeon had to feel awkward asking the question. I told you my name. Would you like to tell me yours? No, Agatha answered tiredly. She was surprised at her own reactions. After everything she had been through, she could still communicate so calmly and even make jokes. Nothing. The sergeant smiled. I'll find out at the station. You can't hide anything from me there. They drove up to a building as gray as the Sutton weather. It was the police station. Agatha didn't want to get out of the warm car into the pouring rain. But she had to. Tim opened the back door of the car and offered her his hand, forgetting that the girl was handcuffed. She even grinned. Such forgetfulness of the guy, and he still somehow got her out of the car and led her into the building. Of course, he didn't have an umbrella, but he didn't need one. The lot was 5 meters away from them. The building was 3 stories high with lights on in almost every window. But it was the lowest floors that were the most stressful, the semi-basement behind bars and windows that looked out just a little bit. Agatha secretly hoped she was being led to the wrong place. But the line of her inner plea was not heard. Tim took her exactly to the basement. She didn't want to go down there, and the guy seemed to notice that. Oh, it's not a prison. Nothing will happen to you, he reassured her and led her down a special dark staircase. When they arrived at the place, Agatha looked around. There were about 5 cameras in total, and only one of them had some girl in a black miniskirt sitting in it. She clearly looked special and with low social responsibility. Tim asked Agatha to take a seat on the bench, and he himself went to the table where his boss was sitting. He was a very overweight man in his mid-40s. He was holding a real cigar in his hands, huffing like a steam engine, filling out some documents by the light of a dim desk lamp. Good afternoon. Peter brought the girl from that wedding. I suppose you've already been informed. The formidable man looked at him sidelong. He clicked his tongue and rolled his eyes. Yes, my daughter was brought here. She was taken to another ward. He answered indifferently. Which ward? How far from here? Tell me? Agatha exclaimed in tears, approaching the chief's desk. Lady, can you keep your temper? The mustachioed man was indignant. Tim came to the rescue. He took Agatha aside and calmly explained to her, don't worry, your daughter is safe. She is on the 2nd floor where they keep street children. Tomorrow she will be dealt with by custody. No, they'll take her. Martin owns everyone in this town. Please don't give her up, Agatha begged. Tim, come here. I found her papers, said the warden. Tim looked at the girl with a smile and then turned around and walked back to the desk. Agatha's 25-year-old daughter has no daughter. Well, further you will familiarize yourself, ordered mustachioed uncle, and then sharply stood up from the table, although the concept of sharply for him was not suitable. His stomach was so huge that when he rose from the chair, he moved the table a couple of centimeters forward. He took his cigar with him and pronounced, pointing at Tim, You all stay on duty, and I've got to go. After these words, he took another look around his favorite basement and then walked toward the stairs. His footsteps and readings could be heard until he stepped onto the flat surface on the 1st floor. Finally, Tim stayed here in charge. The guy walked up to Agatha and said, Now I have to take you to the cell. I'm sorry, you didn't apologize to me like that, said ironically a female voice on the right. It was the one who was now watching them with interest. Tim looked at her indifferently. Agatha only nodded. She didn't want to cause a scandal. That was the way it was supposed to be, and she was also pissed off by that upstart with the smeared makeup. When Tim led Agatha to the outermost cell, it then dryly spat after them. Agatha was shocked at this behavior, but tried to ignore it all. After all, Tim did. When he locked her in the cell, he went to the desk himself and began to study the documents. So, Agatha, and why is it written that there is no daughter? Marveled the guy. The girl wanted to answer, but then she was interrupted again from the neighboring cell. Donna walked, because and did not want to admit. Then a vile laughter sounded. Here Tim could not stand it any longer, went up to this insolent blonde, looked at her with eyes burning with anger, and hissed through his teeth. One more word, dearie, and your temporary imprisonment here will turn into a permanent one. Believe me, I can make that happen. Oh, dearie, what are you going to do to me? The girl who laughed, the warden's giving you a command. You know who's running this, boss? Me too. That's why you're in the cage. Agatha joined the dialogue. And you shameful beggars didn't ask, but walked the child refused and still dares to arise, replied the blonde with pumped lips. How dare you bore? Agatha could not stand it. Tim sighed heavily. Then he reappeared in the dialogue. Then stop it, both of you. He growled menacingly. You turn to the girl of easy virtue. You will speak when asked clearly. Otherwise, every time I open my mouth, you will be fined for failure to observe public order. You will come out of here with debts that you can only pay off with loans. And you, Agatha, keep your temper, please. I'm asking you a question, answer, and don't lie, or it'll be worse. The blonde pouted her lips and sat down on the poplar tree in her cell. Agatha, on the other hand, simply nodded affirmatively. Tim sat back in his seat and continued his questioning. So where did the child come from? I will answer only to you in private. The girl answered confidently. Tim looked at her tiredly, then said, all right, then let's go to the meeting room. They will. It's like a miracle today, a real fairy tale, the blonde exclaimed. Tim looked at her menacingly, but said nothing. He was tired of arguing. In fact, he really wanted to sleep. The guy was completely unprepared for night duty. He hadn't gotten much sleep during the day because the neighbors with small children had been making noise all day. Either they were just mocking him, or they were really making repairs, while killing the kids who were screaming like crazy. At least that's how it seemed to him. Tim came to work a wreck, and of course, by the end of the day his mood was completely gone. He and Agatha came into the meeting room. The girl still doubted that there were no more employees, and she would really be alone with Tim. If anyone listened to their conversation, it would surely reach Martin's ears. But what if Tim was working for him too? She thought about it as she walked down the stairs. She'd have to lie again, but it was a lie. Must look very truthful in some of the details of her story. Still have to come clean. They finally reached the room. Tim closed the door. There was a dim orange light burning in the room, only faces were recognizable. They both sat down and the guy started his questioning. So now tell me whose child this is, and if you are the mother, because all the documents say otherwise. I used to believe official records, but now they don't inspire confidence. Convince me otherwise, it's Rose. My daughter answered Agatha. But the thing is, these documents are forgeries. I mean, remember when you asked me in the car about being forced into marriage? Well, Martin didn't recognize my child from a previous marriage. He made me new papers, and they didn't include my Rose. No mention of a first spouse either. He made it look like they never existed. But how very hard is that to do for falsifying documents? I'll remind you again, this is Martin Newman, one of the richest and most powerful men in our country. You don't think he's capable of document fraud? Yeah, for him it's like drawing a circle on a piece of paper. Tim was thinking. He began to check the documents, but found nothing in them that hinted at forgery. But what about it? I think we should call the warden. He knows how to deal with cases like this. Will he help? No, the girl interrupted him. You don't understand, he controls all the brass, all the police, even the media. He can shut everyone up. Yeah, I'm not so sure you don't work for him too. Tim's last words made me literally cringe. It was like he was terribly offended by that statement. So you don't trust me? But Agatha hesitated. Tim got upset, shook his head as if to show how disappointed he was, and then said, well, okay, I won't call my superiors. But then what should I do? In what way? The girl didn't understand him. Martin will come back for you tomorrow. He'll bail you out and take you to the registry office again. Then you can forget about your daughter. She will be placed in an institution. Agatha's head snapped up. Where can she hide? Where to go? She'll sit in a cage like a trained macaque until morning. And then she would be taken away and forced to marry again. And she had absolutely no idea what means Martin would use this time Tim. Begrudgingly, she began. Help me escape from here. What from surprise? The boy exclaimed. No one had ever dared to make such an impertinent offer to him before. Please, how can I let you go? Are you out of your mind? No, I wouldn't risk my career for a dubious person trying to escape from her own wedding. If you are to marry him, then you will marry him. The boy answered firmly, though it was clear from his face that he didn't believe his own words at all. He just tried again to pretend to be an indifferent and rude boss. But deep down, he was still the same good and sympathetic guy. Agatha by Ace Book. Now she had lost all hope. Tim was right. If this was her destiny, then so be it. The policeman took the girl back to her cell. She was gloomier than a cloud. Tim said nothing to her and silently sat down at the desk to work. It was about 10 o'clock in the evening. The restless blonde was already asleep. Agatha lay silently staring at the ceiling for another hour. Different thoughts crossed her mind. She thought about her daughter, who had not even managed to do anything bad to anyone, and she was already forcibly separated from her parents. She thought about Martin, who was just a psycho, and it was obvious that after everything that had happened, he would take revenge. She reflected on how many lies had come off her lips, which he had told Tim about her bitter fate. Almost all of it had been lies. The boy glanced at her from time to time as he filled out the paperwork, but she continued to stare at the ceiling with a blank, broken look. After about 3 hours, Tim couldn't stand it any longer and approached the bars of Agatha's cell. She looked at him again with a painful, despairing look. And then Tim decided to do the terrible, terrible thing for his career of his life. It was a true miracle for the poor girl. He put the key into the lock and opened it. It fell to the floor with a clatter. Tim was startled. It was that the buxom blonde would wake up, but she was sleeping the dead sleep. The boy opened the creaking door and said in a whisper, "Come out." Agatha looked at him as if he were an angel from whom the light of hope and freedom emanated. She did not hesitate to step out into the open. Tim closed the cage and whispered, "Follow me. Follow all my instructions and we won't be noticed." The girl nodded understandingly and quietly followed her savior. They went up the stairs like mice, and when they reached the first floor, they heard someone's footsteps. Tim immediately pressed the girl against the wall and himself went to the floor. There passed his work colleague, who was on duty on the first floor. "About what and you left?" joyfully said his friend. "And he himself is not happy about it," answered Tim, going as far away from the stairs as possible, as if casually. "Listen, where's that little girl we brought back from the wedding today?" pensively mumbled the guy with a smirk. "The daughter of that stunning hottie." "Yeah, well, settle your fantasies already." "Where's the girl?" "She's probably asleep on the second one." "What do you want?" "The boss told me to talk to her, so I told Tim." "You picked a strange time to talk to a little girl." "Those are the orders." "You know, Peter, sometimes she talks a lot of crap." "Well, since she's asleep, I'll talk to her tomorrow morning." "You, by the way, then early, interviewing her guardianship, wanted to take her away by 12. Dima noticed." "Okay, I'm off, since nothing else is going on. Time to hit the sack. Come on." Tim smiled. They shook hands and went their separate ways. Tim walked towards the stairs as if he were going back to his basement. But in fact, he just wanted to make sure that Agatha hadn't died of a heart attack yet. After those words from his coworker, her daughter was supposed to be taken to the orphanage tomorrow. For a mother, this must be her worst nightmare. "Agatha," whispered Tim, "are you like Roseher?" "No, we won't let that happen," the boy answered confidently. Agatha swallowed, coming to her throat. Calm, and nodded uncertainly. Tim took her hand. The hand was as cold as a corpse's. "It's because the basement is very damp and cold," Tim thought with pity. It would be easy to get sick down there. They went further upstairs, and on the way they met no one else. Only an employee sleeping on a chair who was watching the children's ward, where the street children were kept until they were taken away by the guardianship. The man had dozed off, but could wake up at any moment. Tim prayed that door wasn't a cloud. He still had to get the keys in the keyhole. It seemed impossible. Heavy iron doors with a grated window. The guy realized there was no way around the distraction. He took Agatha aside and explained his plan. She supported him, and they began to act. The girl hid behind the information desk. Tim went up to the guard and touched his shoulder. He didn't wake up. Then the guy sighed and yanked him much harder. And only then the man woke up, slammed his eyes shut. He started looking around as if he didn't realize where he was. The man was completely disoriented in space and time. Sam exclaimed, "Tim, why did he fall asleep?" "I see, sorry." Colonel abruptly jumped up the man, presenting his hand to his temple. Only then did he realize he was talking to a regular sergeant. Tim rode, angry. "What are you going to do? And what are you doing at your desk?" "I'll tell the boss." "You're not a rat." "I know that for a fact. I'm not a rat. But if you want to keep sleeping, help me with the basement." "What's going on down there?" is Sam's less interested question. "Yeah, the batteries don't seem to be working. And you know it's still very cold. Especially in this fucking dungeon. I'll be in the hospital with pneumonia soon." "I don't know. I'm actually watching the kids here." "Oh, where are they going to go?" "You were asleep." "Come on. It'll only take 5 minutes just to figure it out. Give me a hand," I begged Tim. "All right." The man just took it off and followed his comrade downstairs. Tim also made a sign with his hand to Agatha as he left. Agatha made sure they had left and went to the door. She put the keys that Tim had given her in advance into the keyhole. The guy was lucky that his boss trusted him, so he gave him keys to all the departments and finally turned them. She entered a dark room, lit only by the warden's faint light. There were beds everywhere, but there were only 2 children in here, and one of them was her Rose. Agatha recognized her blood at once. The girl was sleeping very soundly. The mother did not wake her daughter up and frighten her. She knew that Rose does not wake up even from the sound of thunder and any noise. So she was sure that the girl would not wake up when she took her in her arms. And she was right. The girl didn't even move when her mother picked her up. She carried her baby out, closed the door, and hid behind the information desk again. A few minutes later, Sam and Tim returned. "I told you it wasn't the wiring." Disgruntled, the little man said. "Who knew?" Tim answered in a feignedly sad voice. "No, you sure did. You're too young." Tim unfired. In the left, the man sat back in his seat and closed his eyes. "That's it. Tim, don't interfere with work," he said, realizing that the guy hadn't left yet. "Good night, Sam." Tim grinned. The man fell asleep quickly, and when Tim was finally sure, he called Agatha to him. She approached him on tiptoe, barely breathing and not making a sound. "Are you sure?" Tim asked confidently, opening the back door leading outside. The service exit for the dark alley employees, where everyone usually went down for a smoke. Agatha only nodded affirmatively. Then the guy opened the door for her, and she stepped out into the barely lit street. She turned around once more to say thank you with her eyes, and then she walked at a brisk pace, with the baby in her arms. But still, after a few seconds, Tim couldn't stand it and caught up with the girl. He was being pulled by some kind of force. He couldn't believe he was doing it himself, but now the guy actually felt some kind of concern for the 2 of them caught up in the jogging strap. He stopped her, touched her fragile shoulder. "Agatha, wait," he said almost in a whisper. The girl shuddered, turned around. There was consternation in her eyes and a maddening weariness. This night was definitely not for sleeping, but it was evident how weary she was. "Where are you going to go?" asked the boy. "Away from this place." Agatha replied indifferently. "You don't even know where to go." "I don't care. I just want to forget this story like a bad dream. I don't care if it goes to hell." Of course, she lied and lied about almost everything. No, she definitely had a plan. "Do you have a place to stay?" Tim asked. "No." "Do you have any money?" "No." After saying that, the guy was completely fenced in. It was as if he tasted victory, because he had already decided everything about himself the moment he let Agatha out of the cell. "Let me help you." Finally, shyly, Tim offered. Agatha looked him over from head to toe, then looked at Rose sleeping in his arms. She really had nowhere to hide right now. Martin would come in the morning and give chase. No matter how much she wanted to, she couldn't escape alone for sure. But you're risking your career. Maybe even your normal life. "If Martin catches us, we'll be eaten to death," the girl explained. "The cameras have already recorded everything. True, I've erased most of the footage from today. But anyway, I'm an accessory to this story now. And if I stay here, I'll be punished, of course. So I have nothing to lose. Let me help you." Agatha was silent. She did not understand why such generosity. But she didn't care about that now. All she cared about was where to hide. While she was pondering in one of the cars parked nearby, a horn sounded. She turned around. Tim was in it. "Did you want to walk?" he asked indignantly, lowering the window. Agatha shook her head. She went to the car, sat in the back, and tried to sag as low as possible in the seat, so that she could not be seen. Her daughter squirmed in her arms and mumbled something in her sleep. Tim turned on the headlights and drove out of the parking lot. The police station slowly moved away from them. Then it disappeared behind the clutter of sleeping buildings of the huge night metropolis. After a few minutes, Agatha asked the logical question, "Where are we going? To my apartment?" Or was she thinking of hiding from that oppressive dwarf? In a different and dirty bride's dress, Agatha only grinned. All the rest of the way they drove in silence. After a while, the car stopped at a gray, unremarkable building. If it weren't for the window with a light on the second floor, one would think that the building had been abandoned for a long time. So dirty and neglected was the facade and everything around it. Tim parked the car, and Agatha ventured to ask, without hiding her surprise, "Do you live here?" "Yes," he smiled embarrassedly. "I rent. But trust me, it's not as bad on the inside as it is on the outside." Tim got out of the car and opened the back door. Taking Rose in his arms, Agatha surprisingly easily trusted him with her daughter. Animal instinct told her that this simple guy posed no threat. He seemed remarkably honest and reasonable. Up close, the building looked even lousier. Some of it had peeled off and needed paint. Some of it was decorated with scarlet graffiti. The young men climbed the rain-wet stairs. Apparently the roof leaked somewhere and smelled of mold and dust. Finally, Tim opened the door to the entryway. It was pitch black inside. You could see absolutely nothing. But Tim didn't seem surprised at all. He stepped back a little and pressed the elevator button, an indicator that showed the floor. It was possible to navigate, and Agatha, too, moved toward the glowing displays. They went up to the top floor. It was almost as dark there, but the faint light of the street lamps still penetrated through the narrow, dusty window. While Tim was opening the door, Agatha touched Sunflower on the small windowsill. The pot fell and shattered. The boy looked at her with a stern and judgmental look. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. It was finally possible to enter the apartment. The light blinded Agatha's eyes, and she could not get used to it for a long time. Light after darkness was a new source of pain in her tormented head. She looked around the apartment. As expected, the rooms were rather shabby, and there was only one bedroom. A typical Khrushchev one-bedroom apartment for a single bachelor. In the kitchen, Agatha noticed a cockroach running around the table looking for food. She almost shrieked with horror. After all, she had always been afraid of these insects. "Oh, to something. It's Valurka. He has long lived here with me," calmed her hospitable host. "You give names to cockroaches." Agatha was amazed. "When you live alone, you can think of many," Tim grinned. He sat down on a chair at the kitchen table and gestured to his companion to do the same. But she looked around in fright, as if searching for someone where Rose was. Loudly and desperately she asked, "Hush, hush, don't shout. I put your daughter in my bed while you were looking around. Don't worry, there are no cockroaches on the couch." I looked into his blue eyes to make sure he wasn't lying. And only then could I sit down at the table. "Your name, right? Not Agatha." For so suddenly he had dumbfounded her with the question. Her heart raced, for what he had just said was absolutely true. She looked at him with eyes round with shock. I began, but Tim interrupted her. "Don't lie to me, please." The girl fell silent. She hesitated to tell him the whole truth or not. On the one hand, he was a policeman who could easily turn her into the authorities. On the other hand, he helped her escape, took care of her daughter, and brought her home, risking everything. Those actions did inspire confidence. Agatha pondered for a moment longer, though she had long since made up her mind. And then she answered, "Yes, you're right. Say your real name, Emma." The guy, leaning on the back of the chair, either it was a gesture of fatigue or distrust. "Emma it is," he said thoughtfully. "Who came up with that? His father always had a fetish, but borrowed names." The girl was silent for a while, then inquired, And how did you know that Agatha was not my real name? I just compared the two facts. The tattoo on your left arm speaks for itself, you know. Emma looked at her tattoo. It was in beautiful handwriting, spelled out in her name, though in English. It was a tattoo she had gotten back when she was 16, secretly from her parents. All because she argued with her friends. Yeah, and she kept doing it. You can't forge documents without changing your name. So it all really came together. Yes, you have talent I do not deny. Smiled at the guy. You'll have tea. The girl looked at him with eyes full of surprise. Sorry, I'm not taught manners, but according to me, guests are always offered tea, said Tim. Emma nodded and stared at the wall. The two demons of whether or not to speak were fighting in her again. There's something I haven't said yet, she began, or rather, I lied to you about almost everything. Everything. About what exactly? Tim asked calmly, pouring tea. About how I ended up here. The thing is, my husband isn't dead, and I don't have any aunt who wants to marry me off. Then who are you? I'll tell you, only you sit down. The boy was worried and sat down on a chair opposite the girl. It was 6 months ago. It had begun. October then stood surprisingly warm, but a fine rain we grew almost every day. Wet yellow and purple leaves lay everywhere on the path. Emma and Alex were walking in the park, and their daughter was collecting beautiful leaves for a herbarium. Mommy, look how many I've collected. Rose shouted with joy. Well done, Sonny. Let's finish up. We'll go to meet your grandfather soon, said Emma. Daughter's fault. They played in the park for half an hour before heading to a restaurant nearby. Emma's father had invited them there. He hadn't seen his granddaughter for lunch in a long time and wanted to see her one last time before he left on a business trip to another country. He was a terrific journalist. He was always being invited to different countries for reports or interviews. The family walked up to a beautiful restaurant with panoramic windows that looked out directly onto a small lake. They were met by a friendly receptionist and led to the right table. Michael, Emma's father, was already seated at it. Grandpa willed Rose, throwing herself into the arms of the sturdy seventh man. The man even lifted the little girl in his arms. She laughed merrily with joy. Emma and Alex came up to them as well. Hi, Dad. With a smile said the girl and kissed her father on the cheek. Alex shook his hand. Everyone sat down at a large table covered with a white, crisp tablecloth. Darling, you look marvelous today. It's a milk dress. It suits you very well, Michael remarked. The daughter smiled in appreciation. Today, she had received 1,000s of admiring looks and compliments on her look. She always looked amazing. The shiny, brown, very thick hair alone. For what it was worth, the shimmering jewelry in her ears, on her fingers, and on her chest harmonized with her outfit. Her husband was proud that he had gotten such a beautiful and intelligent woman. Finally, they placed the order. They began to talk to each other. So why did you invite us? Emma asked her father with a smile. He was a little embarrassed by such a direct question, but still answered, I wanted to see my granddaughter. And also to invite you to something else. Where to? Alex asked with interest. The thing is that I'm leaving soon, and the other day I met an old friend here. You'd be surprised because you've probably heard the name Martin Newman. Poliakov almost choked with admiration. Alex, Emma's husband, was also not averse to playing with adult toys. And in principle, this name was on everyone's tongue, yes, summed up Michael. We've been friends since university. Well, we haven't seen each other for a few years. The other day I was passing by some office and he came out. He recognized each other at once. We exchanged pleasantries, and I told him about my upcoming trip. Everyone listened to him with bated breath. He knows one of the richest and most famous people in the country, and we were definitely already stunned by such a surprise. Well, I invited him to celebrate our meeting to our daksha, Michael continued. And with you, my daughter, we have not talked for a long time. That's why I'm inviting you. The couple looked at each other. They were pleasantly pleased with this proposal. I think we can all get together this weekend. Finally, Emma replied. Her husband nodded his approval. But then they decided to wait for you at the cottage this Saturday, Michael said. He was delighted that the whole family would be together. And his old friend was coming too. Already on Friday, everyone started to get ready for the cottage. "Honey, where did you put my blue shirt?" asked Alex from the other room. Emma answered the laundry, dressing my daughter in pajamas. Alex came into the room with the laundry. "What am I going to wear tomorrow?" He was indignant. "Don't you have any more shirts?" nervously replied the wife. "In the white one I'll look stupid, as if I want to show off in front of this Martin." "Isn't that what you want?" Emma said with a chuckle. The offended husband pouted his lips and slammed the door loudly. The girl laughed. Her husband's behavior was like that of a little boy who wanted to impress some girl. Emma put Rose to bed and went to the kitchen for a drink of water. She was already uncomfortable. She felt hot and cold. Her head rattled as if she'd been hit with rocks. The woman poured herself a glass of water and wrapped herself in the capital. It was at this time that Alex walked into the kitchen. He found a shirt that was to his liking and wanted to show off to his wife, but she didn't seem to care. And it's okay, he was worried. Just whether his wife knew or not. "I feel really bad." She held her hands to her temple and rubbed her head. Nothing helped. "Are you sick or what?" asked the worried husband. "I don't know. Anyway, you can't cancel anything tomorrow. Father will be offended. I'll drink a fever reducer now. Hope it helps. Let's just call Michael and tell him we can't make it. You're his daughter. Wouldn't he understand? Especially if you suddenly gave him an infection before the trip. That's the kind of thing that'll make him resent you." Emma was silent. She looked down at the floor and thought about something for a long time. "No, we're going. Rose really wanted to go, and so do you. I don't want to upset her. It's just a common cold. I just wore an open coat yesterday," she finally said. "Well, I'm not going to argue with you. It's your decision. If anything, you'll lose it tomorrow at the cottage. Right?" "Yes, honey," Emma smiled. That's when they came to a final decision. The whole night Emma had nightmares. Her temperature was already 38 degrees. She decided not to tell her husband. He might not let her go. She wanted to spend time with her father and her family. The next morning, she felt better. Emma was even able to make her family a delicious breakfast of pancakes with condensed milk. "How are you feeling?" asked Alex as they sat at the table. "Good. I feel better already. But I think I'll have to stay home tomorrow," answered Emma. "We'll arrange that," he promised. He hugged and kissed his beloved. Reluctantly, they packed their things and left the house. The journey amounted to 2 hours. They listened to music, talked, sang, played word games, and generally felt perfectly happy. Finally, they arrived at a wooden 2-story house in the old Russian style. Michael met them on the porch. "Daughter, at last," he marveled. "You are as beautiful as ever." And he was right. This day was no different from any other, because the subject always looked beautiful. Despite what she wore from her mother, she had inherited a perfect sense of style. Today, she was wearing a soft blue dress with a white scarf going on top of the accessory. She looked like a real lady. As Michael walked them into the house, he said, "I marvel at you. You have a husband, a small child, a whole carload of responsibilities, and you still manage to look after yourself. Your daddy raised you right. That's a father. But I gotta tell you, that's not the point. It's just that I got a loving husband and an obedient child. That's the secret." The grown-up daughter smiled slyly, looking at her husband half-turned. She saw a faint smile on his face. It was very flattering for him to hear such words from his own wife. Martin was already waiting for them in the house, sitting at the large dining table and pulling up a beer from his mug. He didn't look like a rich man at all. He was dressed quite plainly in an ordinary black sweater jeans, but he had a great haircut. As soon as he saw the guests, he was showered with compliments, especially on the subject of "Oh, ma'am." "You look stunning," he said, kissing her hand. This European etiquette surprised Emma very pleasantly. Her husband, on the other hand, did not like it very much. He immediately took his wife under his arm and led her to the opposite side of the table. False side of the table. "Yes, that's my little girl. You saw it," Michael bragged. "It sure is." Martin stretched out, looking at the angel on the ground. Emma noticed his gaze and smiled. but was a little embarrassed by the attention. Maybe she shouldn't have dressed up like that, but she always looked very stylish. And with her looks, she was always the center of attention. Rose had already run to her room where a lot of toys were waiting for her. On top of that, her grandfather had given her a whole dollhouse. "Mom, we will take this house home," asked the girl. Mom tugged at the sleeve of her dress. "Honey, you come here often enough as it is. Why should we take it with us?" strictly answered the mother. I want to. The girl wouldn't stop. "But we'll give in," and her said already Michael with a smile asked you, "Daughter, your apartment is not small. Put it somewhere." Emma nodded and Rose immediately left her and ran to the second floor to play with her new gift. "Oh, those children," with a smile said Martin. "Do you have children?" Emma asked, stroking her husband's hand. "No," he smiled. "I didn't have a family. It was never going to work out." He sighed a little pretentiously. "At 45, I am still a bachelor." Unfortunately, such a career cannot dock it with a personal life. It's up to you what's best for you. "You're right," Alex answered firmly. He looked at Martin with a hateful look, which was very frightening. "We chose family and we don't regret anything." "And I'm very happy for you," Martin answered. There was a tension in the room. To ease the tension, Michael suggested that they go for a walk around the neighborhood. They went outside. His summer house was located in a rather large village, and the inhabitants of this village 30 years ago planted a beautiful avenue of different species of trees. There was a lot of wedge, so there were empty leaves growing, lying around at every step. "So what do you do, Martin?" asked Emma at last. She held her husband's hand, and the couple walked slowly down the alley. "A little bit of everything. But my main business is computer games. I created a company that produces new games. They're very popular. Oh, it would be cool to play." Emma marveled politely at one of them. She glanced over at Alex. He was walking glum and grim as a freight sky. "Yes, Alex." She turned to him. He nodded. "That's a great idea. We'll play tonight in the company of such a beautiful lady." "It will be lovely," Martin replied. With a meaningful smile, Emma replied with the same joyful expression. There was only one thing bothering her. Emma didn't understand his behavior. He was so eager to meet Martin, and now he was dirtier than a cloud. While Martin and Michael went on chatting about their own things, the girl stopped her husband and took him a little aside. "What's going on?" In a whisper, she asked him, giving Alex a stern look. "I have nothing going on, but you and Martin have something interesting going on." He muttered offensively. "How old are you?" Emma couldn't take it anymore and started whispering angrily. "What are you talking about? I'm only being polite. You should learn some manners from him too, shouldn't you? I haven't heard a single compliment from you in a month." "I've heard plenty from other people," cynically replied the husband. "Well, you know, Alex," Emma gritted her teeth and pushed her husband with her shoulder. She went out into the alley and ran to catch up with Michael and Martin. They stopped, as they were obviously waiting for the couple. Emma waved her handkerchief and made a happy expression, though deep down she wanted to cry. Why did she have such an unattentive husband? She'd had so many suitors, but she'd chosen him. Yes, he's a terrific father, but as a husband, he's always been passive, cowardly, and the little things. Every purchase that was meant for Emma, she paid for it herself. Alex couldn't be expected to do anything, or he had a debt to pay, or the wrong time, or some other apocalypse. Emma was getting tired of it, but there were advantages to the marriage. First of all, the wonderful pedigree and genetics. Rose was smart beyond her years, and she was beautiful. Secondly, not everyone could afford a house in the city center, but thanks to Alex, it was possible. Not that Emma married him for the money, but for true love. It didn't smell like it. Some people will say, "How can you marry at 18?" And they'll say you can. But with age, preferences can change. There's nowhere else to dress. Divorce will hurt the baby. Your whole life will go down the drain. So Alex, we tried to maintain an even relationship with each other, although often there were domestic quarrels between them. "Where do you disappear, dear Emma?" Martin asked. "We've missed you already." "I'm sorry, for God's sake. She started to justify herself to my husband. She turned around to look for support, but Alex was gone. Fell into a ditch. Martin finished for her, laughing. I don't know, Emma said thoughtfully, trying to hide the tears that came to her eyes. They walked for another half an hour. During this time, they discussed fishing, career, family. In general, everything that could be discussed. It was getting close to evening, and dinner wasn't ready yet. Everyone had to go back to the house to start the preparations. Emma took over the chicken with the two soldiers. Martin volunteered to help cut up the groceries. Alex was nowhere to be seen. Emma asked her daughter where her father had gone, but she said she hadn't seen him since they had come in here. It wasn't like him, but there was nothing to be done. Salads don't make themselves. You can cook too. Emma marveled. When Martin helped her make the sauce for the chicken. That's a very strange misconception. Did you know that millionaires can't cook? Martin grinned. It's the cooks who make everything for them. I lived a very ordinary life as a child. And in my student years, I made such culinary masterpieces in the dormitory. Why did you ask your father? He admired them the most, Martin said with a laugh. Liar, you bastard. He went into the kitchen. Michael? No, I won't argue. Your pasta was really good, but the pizza. Did you kill her? The man. It wasn't my fault, it was the oven. Justified the famous businessman. All three of them laughed out loud. They didn't like Martin's company. It was an adult, self-confident person who was ready to tease and laugh at himself, not her Alex, to whom you say a word, and then you have to open the window from his heartfelt remarks. But it should be noted that Martin attracted Emma not as a man, but rather as an older relative. Let's say a jolly uncle, almost a brother to her father. He was positive, friendly, and caring. When Emma had another headache, he kindly offered her some imported pill that was supposedly very good. She regarded the gesture as a sign of politeness and courtesy, but Martin seemed to think otherwise. He repeatedly tried to touch her hand, catching her eye, giving her frank compliments. Eventually, Emma began to tense up, but she put it down to the amount of alcohol she had drunk. The wine they consumed while preparing dinner. Quite a lot indeed. Alex came in when they were finishing dinner. Rose had long since gone to bed. Oh, Alex cheerfully greeted him with a tipsy Emma. So where have you been? My darling, we've already moved on to dessert. Alex looked at everyone with a disgruntled look and stopped his number. He looked at him as if he was about to throw a knife at him and kill him. Yes, indeed, you've been on something of a bender. Laughed the businessman, who was terribly drunk. And then Alex saw what he expected and feared. Martin stroked Emma's knee. She took his hand away every time, and he put his palm on her leg again and again. The woman only smiled politely. She wasn't as drunk as this millionaire and realized he was doing something wrong. As soon as Alex saw these signs of attention from Martin, immediately rushed across the table to this underhatch. He hooked his arms around his neck, causing both of them to collapse on the floor. Emma screamed and urged her father to intervene, who was also drunk and struggling to comprehend what was happening. A real fight broke out between Martin and Alex. They began to beat each other right on the floor. But of course, Alex won, because he was completely sober, which is not to say that Martin is much younger than his opponent. The businessman's broken nose was bleeding. Emma screamed louder and louder. Alex lost his shattered fist. At this point, Michael had already woken up and rushed to separate the fighters at the screams. Frightened Rose. As soon as the girl saw this outrage, she too screamed thinly and loudly. Emma ran up to comfort the poor little girl. She took her to the second floor and tried to put her to sleep again. Mom, Uncle Martin, he's alive, Rose asked fearfully. Of course, he just had a bad fall. And Dad and your grandpa are trying to help him now, lied Emma with a smile. She felt a throbbing pain in her head. Her temperature seemed to be rising again. Whether it was from the stress she had been under or some other reason, the process had intensified. After 10 minutes, Rose was finally able to doze off. When her mother was sure of this, she left the room and carefully closed the door. Downstairs, everything was quiet. Emma was afraid to go back downstairs. She was afraid of seeing something else scary. The first floor was as quiet as a graveyard. It was frightening and intriguing at the same time. Emma walked downstairs and into the dining room where everything happened. To her relief, there were no bodies here, except that Martin was missing. Alex was sitting with a piece of ice on his forehead. Michael was sitting across the table, staring at the table. He was as if in a trance, although it was only alcohol intoxication. "Where's Martin?" "Concerned?" Emma asked, approaching her husband. "And you're only interested in him again?" Alex answered angrily. Were his eyes blazing with rage? "No, he just left," interrupted her father. "As soon as I got him up, he took his things, got dressed, and went out. How could you send him away in this rain?" Emma was outraged. "And the fact that he attacked you in front of me didn't bother you at all? Or don't you care that you have a husband?" "Oh, I'm sorry, he's so rich. Surely he could provide himself a brilliant future." Alex was outraged. "What are you talking about? He was drunk." Emma defended Martin. "That's an excuse. Now you're going to make excuses for him. Even though what he did was ridiculous, he treated me with respect. I've never heard so many compliments from you in my life. And he said so many nice things in one night, and for those nice things. Were you ready to sleep with him? My husband couldn't take it anymore. I didn't expect that from you." With these words, Alex stood up, took his coat, which was hanging on the back of his chair, and left the house. Emma rushed after him, but she could only see the glint of headlights running away into the darkness of the night. "Yes," Michael said. "I didn't expect such a turnaround from this evening." "Daddy," cried Emma, like a little baby. "What am I going to do now?" She collapsed to her knees and covered her eyes with her hands. Only her faint whimpers could be heard. Then she smelled the odor of booze, and then a heavy hand on her shoulder. "Go to bed quietly," her father said. "You're all hot. You need to go to bed. Tomorrow we'll deal with everything." The girl looked into his eyes, which always possessed some soothing magic of a kind of support. She immediately found a sober mind, got to her feet, and sprinted to the bedroom. "The morning is wiser in the evening." This phrase fit the current situation very well. In the morning, Emma woke up to a wild pain in her head. The first thing she did was to go into Rose's room, much to her dismay. She didn't find her there, but Emma thought it was all just a glitch. Because of her illness, surely her daughter must be downstairs having a quiet breakfast. She decided to go downstairs to the kitchen too. She was thirsty. She was thirsty. Looking out the window, she noticed that her father's car was missing. Concerned, she went out on the porch, looked around, and saw a note carefully taped to the wooden door. It said in sloppy handwriting, "We're off with Rose to change the tire. We'll be back later tonight. We're going for a walk. Don't miss us." That short note was definitely written by the father. He was the only one who could put it down like that without any embellishments. Quick, clear, and to the point. She took it for granted. She went back upstairs to her bedroom. She was worried about Alex. He hadn't been online since last night. What if something had happened to him? He'd left in a state of complete rage, angry about where he was going. Left his daughter, his wife, his stuff, just up and left. Emma decided to take her mind off things, sighed, and turned on a TV show. An hour passed, 2, 3. She seemed to fall asleep, and when she woke up, it was already late afternoon. Father and daughter were still gone. 3. The subject matter kept escalating. She had already written 1,000 voicemails to her husband. He never made contact. She poured herself some chamomile tea and wanted to go to her room again. But suddenly she heard the key turning in the door. Emma was frightened for some reason and immediately hid. The feast was in the kitchen. The sound was unlike the usual sound of her father opening the door, more like when a lock is picked. Maybe Dad had lost his keys, but why would he break down his own door? He would call Emma. Then the frightened woman decided to cautiously look out the window. She squatted down and peered out from behind the bollard. An ambulance with blue lights was standing outside, but the lock was indeed being tried by some men. Emma was terrified, but she tried to keep her wits about her. She quietly went up to the second floor. She locked herself in her bedroom and started calling her husband. He was out of range as usual. so she had to record voice messages on the answering machine. "Honey, I know you're mad right now, but I have to tell you right now I'm home alone. Everyone's gone somewhere. There's people banging on my door." She hesitated as she heard a loud conversation on the first floor. She realized that these people were able to break into the house, so her mother decided to prop her door open with at least a bollard. That would hold them off for a while she did so. At the same time, she continued to talk into the phone. "They're already here. They broke into the house. I think it's Martin. God, I'm so scared. Were you right, Alex? Where the hell are you?" She shrieked into the phone when she heard the terrible stomping. They were quite close. Emma pressed send on the message and tucked the phone into the pocket of her robe. She was already prepared for the attack. She moved as far away from the door as possible to the window and armed herself with a table lamp. A moment later, two men in black balaclavas burst into the room. They looked like the very real robbers. Only they weren't after jewelry, they were after a living person. Behind her, one approached, and Emma tried to hit him with her weapon. But this guy seemed to be a good shot and almost immediately knocked the lamp out of her hands. She found herself unarmed. Within moments, something was injected into her hands. A cold liquid spread over venom. After a couple seconds, Emma's eyes ran out and she collapsed to the floor unconscious. One guy threw her onto his shoulder and went to the exit. There, an ambulance was already waiting for them there, with Martin as the head doctor. This car was just a disguise, and for the neighbors, so that they would not ask unnecessary questions, and further told Emma Tim, taking another sip of black tea. "Everything was like a fog. They kept me on some kind of drugs for 6 months. I couldn't walk, talk, or even think for myself. I remember it all like a blackout. It was a living hell. You wouldn't wish it on an enemy. But on the day of the wedding, apparently they lowered my dosage. So when I saw Rose, the girl hesitated. It was as if some gears were turning in her head. She looked carefully at the table, at her hands, and only then raised her eyes to Tim. Wait, she stretched out. How did my Rose show up at the registry office? Here Tim became nervous. On his forehead, protruded under his breath, became cleared. It was all very visible. Tim called out to him Emma in horror. She tensed up too. God, this guy must be one of their gang too. She felt sick to her stomach and her eyes darkened. I'm in on the story too. Finally, he confessed. But don't be frightened, please. I'll explain it all to you now. It was a month ago. I was called on duty to a bar. A police car with blinkers stopped at the door of the bar. Tim got out, tired from his night shift. He saw a drunk who 2 guards were trying to kick out, but they were having no luck. The 3rd guard was already lying on the floor with a bloody nose. That's why the police were called. Tim drew his service weapon leisurely. He approached the drunkard, who was yelling some threatening speeches, and sharply pulled him by the sleeve. He almost fell down, having lost his balance for a couple of seconds. Come with me, strictly said Tim Yanchik, and slowly turned around with a haughty grin. Said, and who are you anyway? Tim didn't bother with him. Shot him in the air. Sobered up and recognized the approaching man as a police officer. Then he turned the man around and was about to handcuff him. Suddenly the drunk kicked him hard in the crotch. Tim was writhing in pain. And at the same time, the scoundrel snatched a gun from him and began to threaten everyone around him. The guards stopped being brave and put their hands behind their heads. And who knows what would have happened if not for one guy who happened to be passing by. He quickly oriented himself, took a heavy rock from the flower in front of the bar, and smashed it on the madman's head. But he did it so carefully that the alcoholic only collapsed to the floor. There was no unconsciousness, no blood, no death. It was just that the young drunk was now lying on the pavement. As soon as Tim got up, he twisted the man around, and he and the guy shoved him into the car after they had done all the paperwork. Tim motioned for the guy to step outside for a smoke. Thanks for your help. I really did. I could have gotten fired for being unprofessional, Tim said. He's lighting a cigarette. What's your name for? What? The guy asked. Tim, just Tim to you. I'm Alex. What are you doing here? That's how they met. Alex told everything about his life to his stolen wife, and that damned thing. When I got that message, Alex told him then, My heart just sank. I was ready to kill myself. You know, I'm an idiot. I left my wife in that position, and now she's been stolen right from her father's house, he lamented. Of course, at that moment I was terribly frightened and started urgently calling my father-in-law. Michael Nikolaevich, your daughter Emma? God, she was kidnapped, shouted Alex into the phone. He was rushing around in circles from place to place, not knowing what to do. More than 12 hours had passed since he'd left home. He was now 2 hours away from this house. There was silence on the phone. Finally, Michael was able to pull himself together and answer. Where did the information come from? She sent me a voicemail. She suspects Martin. Even through the phone you could hear it. Michael's heavy breathing. He was thinking. On the information he had just received. Where are you now? Finally, the man outside his house asked. I left here yesterday and go to the airport right away. Martin will definitely go there. He lives in Washington, after all. Rose and I will be there in about an hour. Keep us posted. Yes, sir. Alex didn't know why he called his father-in-law sir in a moment of danger, but that was Michael's command. He had to become an officer, not a journalist. The boy followed every instruction. He rushed at full speed to the airport and prayed that the Martin had not yet left. He didn't make it. When Alex asked the flight attendant where the plane from flying to Washington, she answered him that the last flight for today was completed. But Alex was not interested in that. Through the panoramic windows of the airport he saw the plane, near which was parked a rather familiar expensive car Martin. The guy almost bruised his legs trying to get out. And he succeeded. Poor Her tried to stop him, called security, but Alex was already running at full speed to his beloved. He jumped out on the takeoff field and ran as fast as he could, like a good sprinter. The plane was about 50 meters away. He personally saw his poor wife being carried on a stretcher into the private plane. Behind her, Martin's Archer came in and times her. He even seemed to smile evasively at Alex before disappearing from sight. But Alex kept on fighting. He ran and ran as fast as he could. But the nasty time was failing him. It was only a couple of meters away from the plane, which had already removed the ramp and was starting to turn its propellers. As it moved from the place and rolled down the runway, and the police were rushing towards Alex. And instead of helping the man who had his wife stolen, they began to beat him with batons. Alex fell on the asphalt. He was panting. Michael's voice was heard screaming. Stop, but they continued to beat him until he lost consciousness. I came out of the medical coma they put me in to survive only 2 months later. Alex continued, telling the story. It took a few more to recover, as soon as I could walk again. Immediately, I sprang into action and am still looking for ways to save my wife. I'm sure you Timka knows the bloody fiend. I don't know him personally, but the whole town's talking about him. He's getting married soon. And then Tim stopped talking. He put all the puzzles together in his head. So it's a wedding. The policeman was amazed. Yes, with my wife. Alex said bitterly, and I'm trying to find a way to prevent it. There was a long silence. And after a few minutes, Tim said, so listen to me carefully. I have a plan. And what's next? Emma asked. She liked the denouement of the story more and more. Now her passive husband played not the least role here. And then it's business as usual. Alex brings her daughter, tells her what to do and how to do it. She's a fighting girl. I'll tell you, so small and so fearless, just fire, not a little girl. Admired Tim Rose. So she bursts into your wedding. And then you know the rest, Tim replied, and exhaled with relief. It was like a weight off his shoulders. But how could it be? I mean, you convincingly didn't believe me, did you? Said Emma. But that was the whole point. You weren't supposed to know all the cards, not while we were in danger. But I don't believe you risked your life and career for a mere passerby who saved my life. Notice, Tim replied with a smile. It still doesn't add up for me. Where is your husband then? You'll find out tomorrow. After all, tomorrow will be an unforgettable day for you. Too intriguing, said Emma. I'm so tired of all this. Tim only shrugged his shoulders. In response, they drank tea in silence and went to bed. Tim gave the girl his old shirt and shorts. The torn white dresses were thrown in the trash. Those he had to sleep on the sofa in the kitchen. But most importantly, Emma was now able to feel safe and comfortable. It had been a long time since she had felt neither where she slept nor how she did it. She was held as if in a fog. Right now, her head was splitting open, and every muscle felt like it was being twisted, pulling at her with a nasty pain. But this is a strong woman. I ordered myself not to think about the pain. The most important thing was to get out of this foreign, hostile city, to get home, to save herself and her daughter. It no longer seemed strange to her that she was sleeping in a strange man's bed, in a strange shirt, missing men's cologne. The main thing now was that she felt alive, an almost sober mind, her own thoughts. How wonderful that was. She would probably have to undergo special treatment to get rid of the remnants of this crap she'd been fed. But she'll get through it all. For herself, for her family, for her daughter. The next day, Emma woke up with terrible anxiety and a dry throat. She drank some water, but it wasn't enough. Her head ached terribly. She looked in the mirror. A layer of anal cream overnight had wiped away everything. And now the pronounced bruises under her eyes could be seen. No, they weren't bruises from her dosage, but from the drugged doorman. She felt absolutely shattered. Emma saw Tim, who had just gotten up from the couch. He too had a glass of water and then walked over to her. Yeah, the guy stretched out. "You look like hell, sis. How are you feeling?" "My head is pounding," admitted his guest. "Oh, that's a manifestation of drug addiction for sure. But don't worry. You don't need an extra dose for that. There are more humane methods." "Like what?" Emma asked with interest. "A silly joke." Repented immediately, Tim. "I don't know exactly what to do in such cases. But I have a gift from my grandmother. She collects all kinds of herbs from my grandmother. She gives it to me whenever we see each other." When he said that, his eyes shone with real love and warmth. I took out a jar of herbs from the cupboard and brewed it all over the kitchen. Immediately, the amazing aroma spread, fresh, leathery meadowgrass and berries of some sort. The two of them finished the whole mesmerized. The kettle, designed for 6 cups if diluted with boiling water. And it did help. And Rose woke up and immediately ran into the kitchen. Mommy, are you here? We made it." "Really, now we're going home." My daughter Emma hugged her brave and little. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "It's okay, Mom," replied this amazing child and affectionately rubbed her cheek and Mommy's hand. "Oh, here comes our savior," winked Tim at her. "Grab the yogurt in the fridge, and let's go." "Run where?" Emma suddenly asked. "What do you mean?" "Do you have a meeting today?" Tim smiled enigmatically. "Tim, what kind of meeting?" "Get cleaned up, and you'll find out." Emma obeyed the boy and went to her room to get dressed. Only then did she realize that her clothes weren't even here. She, embarrassed, walked into the kitchen again. "Woo, I thought you weren't coming." "Okay, not a funny joke," Tim said. "I'm not very good at jokes, if you've noticed. Anyway, I got myself a dress for the occasion." "A little birdie whispered that you're very fond of blue." Emma nodded affirmatively and continued to listen attentively. "Put on a tracksuit and a jacket. You'll find them in my closet. There's nothing else feminine in there. And a hat low over your eyes for 2. And let's go to the meeting." We'd been waiting a long time, and she suspected who she was going to meet. Inwardly, she prepared for a very serious conversation. She and Alex had left on such a terrible note, and it had been more than 6 months. Emma put on everything they had prepared for her and walked back into the kitchen. Rose had already eaten her yogurt and was ready for a new adventure. But how do you see? Fidgeting in front of her, having changed into this too. Seeing him, Emma just awed in her understated pants. The fat one with the graffiti pattern carelessly shifted, the cap worn backwards. Now he looked more like a street hooligan than a law enforcement officer. With a suit like that, I'm not likely to be immediately recognized as a fugitive cop. He laughed, seeing Emma's bewildered look. "Where are we going?" she asked, recovering from the culture shock. "There's a great cafe not far from here," Tim answered cheerfully. "That's where we're meeting." When they left the apartment, Tim checked several times to make sure everything was turned off. And then he brought a huge backpack full of things. As they walked down the stairs, Mom decided to ask why you need so much stuff in the cafe. The boy was surprised. This, alas, is not a cafe. I just forgot to warn you. We're not coming back here again. Now not only Martin, but the entire city police force is looking for us. The first thing they'll do is visit my apartment, so I'm not coming back here. Well, where are you going to go? The girl Emma wouldn't stop. Stop asking questions. Please. All in good time. You'll find out soon enough. They entered an American-style diner. Emma felt like the heroine of a soap opera, although her life for the last 6 months had been somewhat of a horror movie. A hostage victim. Kept on drugs for 6 months. She felt sick when she remembered it. No sooner had they approached the table than Rose burst forward screaming, "Daddy, Daddy! I'm back!" Everyone in the cafe turned to them. Alex only smiled at everyone and sat the restless daughter on his lap. Now it was Emma's turn. When their eyes met across her body, goosebumps ran down her body. She held her breath, and then Alex enclosed her in a tight embrace. They didn't say a word to each other, but it was clear enough. So I don't want to interrupt your happy reunion, but let us rejoice afterward for a while. Tim interrupted them embarrassedly. You're attracting too much attention, and we're running out of time. The couple sat down at the table, and Tim sat down with them. Alex, he said quietly now and then. Emma, as if that name held the deepest meaning. How are you, my poor girl? I missed you so much. Barely holding back tears, replied Alex. I'm so sorry we didn't that night. The guy cut him off. Don't blame yourself for anything. I was the one who was wrong. If only I hadn't left that lousy night. Oh, well, we'll talk about it later. I'll tell you one thing. These terrible months have made me realize one thing. No matter how much we fight, no matter how many misunderstandings, it happens to everybody. What matters is that we have each other. I'll never leave you again. You should know how much effort I spent trying to get here, and I got here to save you. Whatever it cost me. Terrific speech. Ironic, said Tim. The Oscar bro, we'll rehearse another time. Right now, our problem is we're running out of time. And you still haven't told her about our plan. The thing is, began Alex, addressing his wife, that they won't let us out of town for nothing. We are wanted. To be exact, you, Rose, and Tim. That's why Tim and I have devised a whole plan. Alex leaned even closer so that the plan could not be heard by prying ears. However, here in this noisy second-rate diner on the outskirts, they had no fear of stalkers. There's a van in the backyard. It's got ice cream on it. To get out of here without being seen, I took out a sole proprietorship. Basically, pretend I'm a real entrepreneur, driving freight, all that stuff. Unload the whole van. There's a refrigerated truck full of ice cream, and it's got a secret section. Your father and I set it up. They're opening it up. Check, please. It's filled with boxes of ice cream. It's like a refrigerator on wheels. But you're comfortable and warm inside. You'll see, once we're all loaded, I get in the driver's seat and calmly drive us to where we'll start our new life. The plan was as foolproof as a Swiss watch. All the characters in this story played their roles brilliantly. Rose, Emma, and Tim took refuge in the trailer, piled with boxes of the most authentic ice cream. Alex got behind the wheel. Inside the passenger compartment, everything was furnished like in the smallest hotel room. There were bunks, a mini kitchen, and a toilet. You could live here for years if you needed 5-star comfort. Rose was absolutely delighted. It's just a shame you can't see out the windows. She complained a little, but then she got better. But we'll go as real spies for the ladies. Emma smiled at her daughter. She was glad this whole nightmare was finally coming to an end. How did you ask her Tim after hours on the road? I'm good. I mean, I still want to dose, but I realize it's an addiction. I'll get there as soon as I can. I'll see a doctor. Then they slept, then they stopped somewhere and slept. Alex to take a break. It seems that after almost a full day's journey, they were already approaching familiar homelands. We are already in Utah. Alex joyfully informed them at the next stop. Suddenly, at some point in the journey, the truck accelerated sharply. It was very noticeable. The passengers in the trailer got worried. Tim tapped Alex on the wall. He opened a secret window between the cab and the body. Alex, where are you going so fast? We're getting there. Unfortunately, we are not alone. We have time for everything. Nervously answered Alex, pressing the gas even more. We are being chased. Hold on, don't panic. That's for sure. There were Martin's men. They were following them in a huge armored jeep, and after a while, they started shooting at the tires. That's when it got really scary. Emma, take Rose and hide behind the closet. Make a barricade of pillows, Tim ordered. While they were doing that, Tim pulled his service gun out of his pocket, causing Emma to have a real nervous breakdown. What is that? Screamed she. Gun. Unless you want to die, you're going to have to choose either their life or yours. Tim replied firmly. A real firefight broke out. Alex and Tim were shooting back from the cabin. Emma plugged Rose's ears with her hands and shook in the inner trailer. She smiled at her daughter and told her everything was fine. Alex continued to increase speed, trying to get away from the pursuers, and it seemed that everything was already over. On the narrow mountain serpentine, it became quite bad. The long truck was being tossed back and forth at breakneck speed. Emma prayed silently that they wouldn't drive off the cliff. And then she heard a familiar, nasty voice from the loudspeaker stop the car. If you don't want to get hurt, it was Martin. Was he there too? And we were very surprised to hear that. It's a pretty dangerous race. Wouldn't he be sorry to risk his life? He'd send his thugs away from them. But the question was unanswered, and the truck accidentally crashed into a roadblock. They rammed the back of the truck and boxes of ice cream spilled onto the road. But that's nothing. At high speed, the truck hit a lamppost, which collapsed right onto the road. It didn't just block the path of Martin's car. It knocked her serpentine. The car dangled for a full minute, spinning and wheeling helplessly over the precipice. And then it went down. There was a massive explosion. Our fugitives watched in complete prostration. Shocked by this outcome, they all ran out of the van to see what had happened to the pursuer's car. And it seems that now these scary people no longer posed any threat to them. Oh my God, Alex. I squealed, either from joy or shock. Emma, what have you done? What have we all done? What's going to happen now? The boy was tensely silent. He realized for himself what had just happened. It could certainly be considered an unintentional murder, unless one knew the full background of the events. And if you did, then it was a planned murder. That's a whole different story. Let's get downstairs, screamed Emma in a panic. Maybe they can still help her as best they can, trying to calm her down. Emma, they can't be helped. They're all dead. Now that creep won't hurt you anymore. No moaning. Anna, no, it's not that wrong. We didn't mean to. We couldn't kill them. If we hadn't killed them, they would have killed us. Didn't blink an eye. Tim continued to stand his ground. A few minutes later, they called the rescue services. Those, of course, arrested the driver of the perpetrator of the whole situation and safely took him to the police station. Tim. And almost unhinged from terror, the young mother and her daughter were driven to Emma and Alex's home in the center. Alex's trial was not scheduled until 2.5 weeks later. During this time, Tim and Emma visited him every day. In one of those visits, Emma suddenly realized that she really loved her husband. She doesn't need a divorce to settle domestic disputes. And she's not a coward at all to just run away from her problems now. What's the best shirt for me to wear? She asked Tim, who was finishing the coffee in her kitchen. They're all the same. The guy shrugged. What's the point? Emma couldn't take it anymore. This one's milky, and this one's pure white. Tim took another look at the shirts. To him, they were exactly the same. But he tried to lie. Well, take the right one, it's white. She, on the contrary, is milky. Nervously uttered the girl. She had already resigned herself to the fact that Tim thought absolutely nothing in style and colors. Case number 320 is being heard. Monotonously pronounced the judge. The defendant is accused of premeditated murder of several persons. All the victims died as a result of a traffic accident. The trial lasted 2.5 hours. During all those long and crawling hours and minutes, Emma never once left the courtroom. She was terribly worried about the fate of her husband because her own life depended on it. Alex was found guilty of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 7 years in a penal colony of general regime. And it seemed that she was about to faint from these cruel phrases. But I think she expected that. She obediently listened to the verdict and left the courtroom with the others on wooden legs. But once at home, she was pissed off badly. How on earth could a man be given 7 years in prison on the condition that they chased him and threatened his safety? Well, first of all, the court doesn't know anything about it, Tim explained to her. And there's no need for this psycho to know. I'm sure there's a whole bunch of associates left. I don't know. They know less, as they say. They sleep better. And Alex, willingly or unwillingly, killed them. So everything is fair here. The girl turned to him unhappily and looked straight into his eyes. You are now, by the way, sitting on his favorite chair. Honey, please be reasonable. Dad stood up for Tim. I understand the stress you've been under. It's terrible. We thought we'd lost you forever. But please understand, Alex was put away for a reason. People died because of him. No matter how bad they were still people. Emma sat next to her father on the couch and pressed her body against his. Then she whimpered into his sweater like a little girl. She wanted so badly to feel the warmth of a loved one beside her. But the most beloved person today was not here. And that's terrible. Handing it in. Finally, the deadline approached and Emma was able to visit her husband. The prison was quite large. When Alex was brought out, she was pleasantly surprised. He looked quite neat in his striped robe. Alex sat down across from her and picked up the phone. Emma couldn't contain her feelings and cried. How are you doing, honey? She asked. It's pretty normal for a prison. I'm not being starved or beaten, so I'm not suffering. How are you doing? We're fine. Rose goes to daycare. I miss bringing Rose here too. I don't want her to grow up without a father. Besides, they say you can get parole if you behave yourself. I'll do my best. That's when they said goodbye. They only had a few minutes to talk. It was very upsetting for Emma. But she was told they gave her more time at lunchtime. The next day, her father called her with a very strange proposal. Honey, I want to make a movie about you, he said about me. Emma was surprised. About all the horror you've been through. Come to the studio today and we'll discuss everything there. And indeed, Michael decided to release not exactly a movie, but a TV show where Emma would tell the whole country all the details of the nightmare, and then their consequences. This program instantly gained millions of views and became very popular. The case of Emma and Alex received wide publicity, and in a few months under public pressure, the court decision was changed. And Alex was finally able to be home with his family and even received compensation for wrongful imprisonment. Daddy, Daddy, Rose shouted when she was finally able to see her birth father alive and well. Now they were recognized on the streets. Books were written about their plight, and even movies were made. Emma's story has touched the hearts of many, many people. Some found in it motivation for themselves. Others offered support for Emma herself, who had been through such an ordeal. Here's what respondents to a small survey once said in the studio on a talk show. Emma's story inspired me to be braver, to not be afraid of my own prejudices. After all, if she could get out of the hands of such a villain, out of such hopelessness, then I can solve my problems. They're nothing compared to her family's. And that was the end of it. Tim forever became a full-fledged member of the family Oi, named Brother Alex and favorite Uncle Rose. He retired from the authorities and together with Alex. On the warm southern shores, Alex's travel business. We began to quarrel much less often. And we cemented our union with the birth of another child. And Emma's father became well known and achieved great success in his profession.
Subscribe and click the bell.
Mommy, I'm cold, said 5-year-old Kelly said calmly, mundanely. Not complaining, just giving information. She was the one who cried at first, but then somehow even accepted their new life. Not for nothing they say that children quickly adapt to everything new. Perhaps Nancy Mom Girl was even harder to get used to the fact that over the past year, hunger and cold have become integral parts of their lives. Be patient for a while. Daughter affectionately, she said, trying to hide the traitorous shiver in her voice. They'll bring the stove to be heated, porridge for their own. Everything will be all right. My darling. I know, Mom, replied Kelly confidently. Let me help you with the firewood. No, I got it, Nancy hastily replied. She stepped out of the decrepit shed and tried to make sure her daughter didn't see the tears on her face. It wasn't hard to do. The only light they had was provided by an old oil lamp. Of course, it was simply not capable of properly illuminating all the rooms, and often Nancy thought it was for the best. The shed was cramped with one single window under the low ceiling, where instead of the long drunken glass they put simple polyethylene film. True, in several layers. For better heat preservation, the sunlight penetrating inside became dull and dreary, perfectly harmonized with the shabby furnishings of the room. The only furniture here was 2 narrow beds, a small closet, an old stove, which served the mother and daughter as a stove for cooking and heaters. The only consolation was that the barn was solid oak logs, so it was in no danger of collapse or a hole in the floor or ceiling. In fact, it had been used as a temporary home for the family a long time ago, before they built a new big and spacious house, because it was not easy to live here, but it was possible. Nancy herself, come to think of it, had grown up in more difficult circumstances, though that fact was hardly a comfort to her. At first, though, she had been about the age that little Kelly was now. Everything in her life was fine. She herself, of course, did not remember those times very well, and relied more on her mother's stories. She often recalled what a wonderful man, husband, and father Nancy's late father had been, working and then not helping and babysitting when he had time. And of course, he loved Mom very much, just as she loved him. And they lived, as they call it, soul to soul without any quarrels and scandals. They raised their daughter, saved money for a larger apartment, planning that soon little Nancy would have a brother too. The only thing that marred this relationship turned out to be Nancy's mom-dad. Her mother didn't like her mother-in-law from the very moment the young people met each other, and she didn't even think about hiding this fact or trying to get in touch with her daughter-in-law and get to know her better. She was the kind of woman for whom their children, especially their sons, make up their whole world, are the meaning and center of all their dull and gray life. Such see their offspring's partners not as their personal happiness, but as their misfortune, and see them as rivals for their precious child's attention. That is why Nancy and the mother had no chance to get along with her mother-in-law, though she tried her best to do so. She tried everything. She came to visit with flowers and candy and tried to find common interests. Even had nothing against the fact that her husband all weekend spent not with her, but with his parents. Everything was in vain. Any contact between them ended in an ugly scandal arranged by her mother-in-law. Nancy's father, caught between the 2 women he loved, was also unable to find ways to reconcile them, despite his best efforts, so he shuttled between them, trying to give each of them enough attention without offending the other. Maybe it's the constant tension. That's what ultimately caused him to pass away too soon. Yes, in addition, for the reason that rarely takes young people away, he was not yet 30 years old when a heart attack brought him to the grave. Nancy's mom, of course, grieved terribly, but had no idea that major trials were yet to come for her. A few days after the secret father was buried on the doorstep of their apartment, the mother-in-law showed up. Mom at first even rejoiced at this visit. She decided that there is a blessing in disguise. Maybe now, having lost her son, the woman will show at least some interest in the only reminder of him that remained in this world, his daughter, and consequently, her own granddaughter, whose existence she had not even noticed until then. Of course, after all that there could be no more warm relations between the 2 women, but perhaps they would have turned from openly hostile to neutral and calm. But that wasn't the case. The mother-in-law had other plans, and she didn't come to reconcile with her daughter-in-law and share her grief. "What's up, bitch?" She started right from the doorstep. "You've gotten your way and you've driven my son into the grave." "Miranda, what are you talking about?" That Molly, the mother, was confused. "What I am saying is the truth I am saying. I always knew this was how it would end. From the moment I saw you, I knew it right away. This girl will ruin my Leshchenko. He must run away from her. But he did not listen to me. So he paid for it. Miranda, I understand your grief, but you're unfair to me. Oh, unfair, the mother-in-law exclaimed. I'll show you justice. Such a viper. She literally threw in her daughter-in-law's face some very weighty folder. And while the thin mother opened it and tried to figure out what it all meant, she continued her monologue. Take this. She nodded contemptuously at the little Nancy with frightened eyes, looking out of the cradle at the whole scene. And get out of my apartment so you won't be here before tonight. What do you mean out of your apartment? More surprised. What did Nancy resent? Mom, we bought it when we were married. It is a jointly acquired property, which now belongs to me and our daughter, your, by the way, granddaughter. And you look at the documents, said the mother-in-law. And what? Just so they gave you the apartment. Leshchenko wrote on me. At least on this, he had enough brains. And that, you see, jointly acquired while my poor son humping at work at 12 o'clock a day. You've been living off the books here, haven't you? Of course, the daughter-in-law could answer that she worked before Nancy was born. She even went on maternity leave just before she gave birth, and before that she worked as hard as her husband. But she wouldn't do it. In the first place, because it was useless to argue with her mother-in-law. She would not listen to any arguments anyway. And secondly, the woman simply did not have the strength to say anything. The fact is that she still looked into the folder and made sure that her mother-in-law said the truth. The apartment, according to the documents, belonged to her. And this could only mean one thing. From that moment on, both she and her young daughter were homeless. What followed was several years of unrelenting hell. They moved around in some communal apartments, often changing them as the rent went up. The mother's small salary was barely enough to support them, and there was no one to help them. After all, the woman was an orphan. Her strength was only enough to somehow drag her only daughter to adulthood, for which she was very grateful. And even the day Nancy turned 18, her mother went to meet her father. Her heart, too, could not bear all the strain and turmoil that had been heaped on her fragile shoulders. So she was left alone. Now she had to earn her own living, the good of all that was needed. Her mother had time to teach her, and in addition, showed her a perfect example of how carefully one should treat the choice of a life partner. And the very young girl promised herself that she would never repeat her mother's mistakes and would not allow her children to live in such conditions as she herself had to live in. Because of constant moving, Nancy often had to change schools. Often it turned out so that she only had time to get used to the new place, but had to break off again and go to another neighborhood, or even the city. Of course, under such conditions, she studied not too well, and the question of entering the university in front of her did not even stand, and the early death of her mother made it impossible for her to get a higher education. To feed herself, the girl had to get a job right after graduation. She was lucky. Probably the first time in her conscious life, she managed to get a position as a sales consultant in a very expensive clothing store. Of course, the work was hard and quite boring, like any unskilled labor. However, it was still a better option than getting a job as a cleaner or dishwasher. And the salary she was offered was quite decent. With that money, she could even rent herself a decent room. One of its main advantages was that it could be locked from the inside. Nancy's life was very monotonous. Work, home, work again, and so on. The girl didn't have too many weekends, and it could be called her personal choice. She herself took a large number of extra shifts to get more money. In those days, she earned as much as her mother had never dreamed of. However, like many children from poor families who had a very difficult childhood, she had fallen into one of two extremes between denying herself everything and fanatically hoarding money for emergencies and mindlessly spending it. Nancy chose the second option. The thought of not buying something she didn't really need but could afford was almost physically painful. Fortunately, she did not get into any loans and debts and lived quite well within the means that she had. Nevertheless, Nancy spent all her salary without a trace, often on things that were not necessary at all, on pretty brooches, bracelets, trips to cafes, movie tickets, and other pleasant trifles. Often she told herself that it would be good to start saving. Even once she thought that if she limited herself to only the really necessary things, she could have already saved, for example, for the first installment on the mortgage, or just create a very substantial safety cushion. In her mind, however, realizing how important all of this was, Nancy could not bring herself to start saving. Emotions whispered to her that she was doing just fine now. There didn't seem to be any emergencies. She was doing well, so she could not be afraid of dismissal, as well as, for example, the ruin of a very popular chain of stores, one of which she worked in. And every time she listened to her emotions, which were stronger than the voice of reason, of course, then scolded herself for it, but could not fix anything, and only promised herself that from the next paycheck she would definitely begin to behave more reasonably. Which, of course, never happened. That's how she lived until she met Charles. He came into her store, completely unplanned, in the mall where Nancy worked. He was supposed to have some very important work meeting, but on the way out, his pants were rolled up with mud by a passing car driver. Here was a man looking for more to his good fortune. Charles arrived at the meeting well in advance. It turned out that he didn't have a typical clothing size, and Nancy spent almost 40 minutes trying to find some pants that would fit the man more or less decently. Finally, she succeeded. He was satisfied with the quality of service and promised to come back for more shopping sometime. Something to brighten up the long search. Nancy and Charles were having a very lively conversation, and if at first it was just about the weather outside the window, then they talked about other topics, including the fact that they liked the same music and the same movies, and found some more common ground. He came in again 2 weeks later with a coffee stain on his jacket. In a strange coincidence, it was Nancy who served him again. When she saw that the customer had the same problem again, she couldn't help but laugh. To her surprise, Charles was not offended at all. On the contrary, appreciating the ridiculousness of the situation, he joined her. "And you excuse me," Nancy said at last. "It's just that it's really kind of funny." "You don't say." He echoed a second time in the same place. "And you're here again. Either your mall has some kind of enchantment or the universe is subtly telling me that it's better not to deal with these partners. Don't think this happens to me all the time. Honestly, 2 weeks ago was the first time in my entire life. Or maybe it's our store that's bewitched." Nancy smiled. "Attracted to you. It makes a certain amount of sense," Charles replied. "But it's probably not the store itself that attracts me, but one of its charming employees. To tell you the truth, I've been thinking about you all these days." "Oh, that's very nice," Nancy said. "And I think I'll answer frankly to frankness. I've been thinking of you too. I think we had a very successful conversation last time," Charles confirmed enthusiastically. "Well, if that's so, let me ask you when your next day off is expected." Nancy had never been so happy about the end of the month. They had extra shifts at the beginning of each month. That's because she hadn't had time to pick up any extra work yet. And the next day off she had to come in just a couple of days, and she informed her new acquaintance about it. Their romance developed rapidly. Both of them never believed in such nonsense as love at first sight, and both of them found it. Already in a month they were practically inseparable, spending all their free time together. Nancy, to the surprise of her superiors, even stopped taking extra shifts. Of course, formally it was not a prerequisite for work, but everyone had already gotten used to the fact that the girl always helps out her colleagues. In addition, it was accepted in the store, albeit unspoken, that a certain number of extra hours were taken by all employees without exception. And now, when Nancy decided to work only those shifts, which were assigned to her under the contract, in the team began serious conflicts. The girl still performed her work well, not giving the bosses the slightest reason for her dismissal. However, no one could prevent them from depriving her of her bonus, which was a large part of her salary. and her coworkers started to shit on the smallest things, literally making her stay in the store completely unbearable. Nancy, in spite of everything, did not even think of giving up. She continued to simply perform her duties, despite all the difficulties and obstacles. However, with her new salary, she was no longer able to afford not only entertainment, but even to rent a room. From Charles, Nancy hid her problems to the last. But of course, he could not help noticing the changes taking place with his favorite woman. "Nancy," he said one day, "I'm sorry, of course. Perhaps I'm minding my own business. But there's something that's been bothering you a lot lately. Is there anything I can do to help you? Or at least just listen? Sometimes it can be really helpful to talk things out. Just a little trouble at work." She waved it off. "Nothing particularly serious, right?" Charles asked, looking at her intently. "Right." Nancy tried to answer firmly and confidently, but her voice shook involuntarily. Charles continued to stare at her without saying a word. He realized that the matter was much more serious than she was trying to make it seem. But he also realized that if he questioned her, Nancy would simply shut herself up and certainly not say a word to him. So he waited patiently for the girl to gather her strength and tell him about her problem. And so she did. After a few minutes of tense silence, Nancy, tired of pretending, burst into tears at the table of the cafe where they were sitting. Charles embraced her and started stroking her back and head, letting her know that he was near and ready to support her in any situation. Finally, she calmed down enough to speak, even though her words were jumbled. Pity with them, sobs behind them. "You see, it's actually because of you. I mean, I'm not saying it's your fault. In fact, you had nothing to do with it at all. I mean, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to offend you. Nancy, just tell me everything from the beginning." "From the beginning, yes," she echoed. "You see, when you and I started dating, I stopped taking extra shifts at the store. It's not technically illegal, but I understand," Charles echoed. "But they can't fire you for that, can they?" "Of course they can't fire me, but they can take a pay cut. I don't know how to live on the money I get now, not enough to buy food or rent a room. I'm afraid that I'll soon get into debt or something like that. I have absolutely no idea what to do in this situation." "What do you mean, what?" Charles was surprised. "Quit. If the conditions are so unbearable, is there any point in putting up with them?" Nancy tried to object, but the man didn't let her say a word. "I understand what you're saying. That's exactly what they want. If you fire them, they all kind of benefit. So be it. Do you want to work in a group like that?" "Oh, no." Sadly, Nancy sighed. "And I hadn't even thought about it. But if now I have enough money for food or shelter, when I quit, I won't have enough for anything. And it's not like I'll be able to find a new job anytime soon." "Well, first of all, I'm sure you can. As far as I can tell, you're a pretty good salesman. There's a lot of talent out there. I think your employer's competitors are gonna have a field day with you. And secondly, why would you want to live in a room with strangers? Come to my place. I think this step in our relationship has been a long time coming. I've been hesitant to invite you, and my income is enough for the two of us." Charles, "Well, it's a little awkward, Nancy. I don't want to sit on someone's neck, especially not on the man I love. I'm not dating you for your money or your business. Don't worry, honey, I'm well aware of that. Otherwise, I wouldn't be making you this offer. It wouldn't be a pleasure to have you in my apartment." Still, Nancy was not ready to accept this generous offer so immediately. For another 2 weeks, she walked around pondering whether she should move in and quit her job. The rapidity with which their relationship was developing was somewhat frightening to the girl, but in the end, she made her decision and agreed. After all, Charles was certainly right about one thing. She would be able to find a new job anyway. And if things went wrong in their life together, she could rent another room and move out. So why not give it a try? It often happens that when people start living together, they quickly find out that they are actually incompatible. There are domestic conflicts, or even it turns out that it's not very easy to bear each other in a small piece of space every day. In the case of Nancy and Charles, it was nothing like that. On the contrary, when the two moved in together, it was as if they had become even closer and closer to each other. The wedding was fast approaching. There was only one thing that confused the girl. Finding a new job was not as easy as they had thought it would be. Nancy was really a good saleswoman and had learned a lot while working in her store. She had everything one could wish for: experience, knowledge, skills, and an innate quality suited to this line of work. Nevertheless, no one wanted to hire her. The girl even began to suspect that this is a kind of greeting from previous employers who gave her a disgusting characteristic. However, most likely, it was something else. She was even too good for her job and had the appropriate salary expectations, and no one was willing to pay her the money she was asking for. It was easier to hire less talented girls who were able to do some work, but who wanted less money. But of course, no one talked about it openly. Otherwise, Nancy might have reduced her appetite. But alas, she had no idea that this was what had to be done. "Come on, Nancy," Charles urged her. "I told you 1,000 times what I earn. It's enough for the two of us, even the three of us. I mean, when we decide to have a baby. And if something happens to you, would you mind?" Nancy, oh, what could happen to me? Get hit by a streetcar, or a brick fall on my head. So something like that can happen at any time, including before you even get a job. You can't be safe, honey, but it's worth a try. Well, see, you've been trying for a month now, and it's no use. Well, at least for the relay race. You deserve a vacation. Let's get married. We'll go on a vacation, and then you can go on with your search, if it's so important to you. In the end, Nancy agreed with her fiancé and went into wedding planning. She wanted the celebration to be perfect, so she tried to think about every little detail. Then it was time to meet Charles' mother and her future mother-in-law. Frankly speaking, this moment with Nancy was postponed to the last. But now, on the eve of the wedding, it was quite impossible to avoid it. Unless, of course, we take into account the absurd variant when they will get acquainted directly at the solemn event. The fact is that Nancy was terribly afraid of meeting her future mother-in-law. I remember the terrible experience of my own mother and paternal grandmother. She understood perfectly well that if the relationship does not work out, will come to an end, and her romance with Charles, no matter how much she loved him, it will be impossible to live constantly expecting a blow in the back from his mother. She will certainly be expecting it, even if those fears prove unfounded in the end. This, in turn, may well spoil the relationship and with her husband, and even lead to a painful breakup. So it would be better to break this connection. At once, it will be less traumatic for everyone involved in the events. Of course, Nancy did not share these concerns with her fiancé. He might have taken them to mean that she herself was prejudiced against his mother, though it was not so at all. On the contrary, she sincerely hoped that she would be a nice, kind woman, and that they would be able to find a common language. Charles, who was very sensitive to his bride's moods, did not ask her about anything this time. Of course, he could see her excitement, but he wrote it off as the usual wedding condition peculiar to many women. He even considered himself lucky. The future spouse, not crying all day long, is engaged in some quite constructive activity. Good for him. Besides, in these hectic weeks, Charles was working much harder than usual. He had to get the money for the wedding trip he had already promised Nancy, and he had a great deal of business to attend to so that nothing would fall apart in his absence. After all, being the owner of his own firm, that's a big responsibility. And so the day finally came when Nancy was to meet Charles's mother. From the very morning, she made a fuss, cleaned the apartment, which already shone with crystal cleanliness, cooked, even did the laundry, and then dried it with a hairdryer. You can't show a guest and hang her son's underwear out to dry. Nancy, honey, don't be nervous. You said so, and Charles, I'm sure Mom will like you without all this preparation. And if she doesn't, trust me. I've known this woman for years, Charles said with a laugh. Besides, if she doesn't like you, she won't like you. And what will it change? The main thing is that I love you, and my mother doesn't have to." Nancy bit his lip painfully, but kept silent. It didn't matter to him. And from her point of view, if not everything was at stake, then a lot was at stake. It was this meeting that would determine whether their wedding would even happen and whether the relationship would continue. But of course, it was not worth it to frighten Charles with these thoughts beforehand. It was enough that she herself was on pins and needles. At exactly the appointed hour, the doorbell rang, and Nancy hurried to open it. On the threshold stood a woman, quite friendly looking, holding a cake exactly like the one the hostess herself had bought for the table. She had no time to realize whether it was a bad sign or a good one. The girl on the machine politely said hello to the Bones and invited her to come in. As it turned out, a little later, the same confectionery turned out to be a good omen after all. Molly, the mother-in-law's name, laughed when she saw the same cake on the table, and then happily concluded that since they had similar tastes in sweets, they would somehow manage to agree on everything else. She was a cheerful and pleasant woman. By the end of the dinner, Nancy was chatting with her as if she were an old friend whom she had known since childhood. The bride's mood was rapidly improving. Nothing was going to stop her from marrying Charles, and it was definitely the best news of her life. They had a very modest wedding, not even because they were against noisy and left-field celebrations. It just so happened that there was no one in particular to invite to it. Nancy's parents were long gone. She had no time to make friends. Charles, head over heels in his business, didn't have too many friends either. His father, as it turned out, had died a few years ago, passing the family business on to his son. "What happened to your dad?" Nancy asked me one day. Charles instantly became as serious and focused as the girl had never seen him before. But it was not even this that struck her, but the fact that his face showed not only sorrow, but extreme thoughtfulness, as if his father's death were not a personal tragedy for him, but a mystery he could not solve. You see, it was a strange story. They said he had a heart attack. He was only a little over 40. My dad wasn't even 30 when he died of a heart attack, noted Nancy, who didn't find that fact particularly surprising. "Yeah, but mine was perfectly healthy. And I'm sorry, but you told me yourself he had a busy life. Stress and all that. And I doubt he was as obsessed with his health as my constant running around to doctors, mandatory annual checkups, that sort of thing. And he made me and my mother get checked. And there was no sign that he had any heart problems. And then all of a sudden he had a heart attack. It's really weird. But you don't think somebody killed him, do you? Poisoned him or something? Honestly, that's what I think. But why? I mean, you ended up with the business. And as far as I'm concerned, it's been yours for years and you're fine. Could there be any other reason? You're right, of course. Maybe I was just overreacting. I did go to the police, but they didn't find anything suspicious. Seeing how hard it was for Charles to think about the story, Nancy never spoke of his father again. After all, even if he did die of causes other than natural causes, it was unlikely they would ever know the truth, although she personally thought it more likely that the man had actually had a heart attack. All sorts of things happen, including to perfectly healthy people. After the wedding, Nancy and Charles went on a fascinating trip to Europe. The girl, who had never been abroad for a month, came back from there filled with impressions. She felt absolutely happy. She had never experienced such emotions in her entire life. Now, however, they were back in their hometown, and life flowed as it should. Nancy resumed her search for work, which remained as unsuccessful as ever. True, it didn't upset her so much now. She was sure that her husband would help her through any difficulties, and indeed she felt like she was behind a stone wall. A few weeks had passed since their return from their wedding trip. When Nancy found out that she was pregnant, she hurried to share this joyful discovery with Charles. But his reaction was not what the woman had expected. She had hoped that he would share this happy moment with her. But instead, he almost started tearing his hair out. "Charles, honey, aren't you happy we're having a baby? You wanted one too, didn't you?" "Didn't you?" Charles sighed. I still do. I really do. I don't mean that. It's just that it's a terrible bad time. What do you mean? Nancy was worried. He looked long and earnestly at his wife, as if assessing what was worth saying, what was better left unsaid. Or maybe he was just gathering his strength. The woman could clearly see how hard it was for him. And besides, she remembered some other facts that she had not paid attention to before. For example, that after Charles returned from Europe, he worked even harder than he had just before the wedding, and certainly more than before. At the very beginning of their acquaintance, and it was supposed to be the other way around. He had settled a great many things before he left, and now he should have been freer. Was it a mistress? A traitorous thought flashed through her mind. Nancy immediately brushed it aside, and was even ashamed that she could have thought such a thing. But what mistress indeed? When would he have had time to get to know her? If they had been together all the time lately. Unless it was before they were married. But then what was the point of getting married? No, it's obviously something else. I mean, Charles finally said, "My business is falling apart. And all I've been doing since we got back is trying to stop this avalanche with my bare hands. I'm sorry. I didn't want to bother you, so I didn't tell you. But now that you are, well, I'm obligated to notify you so you can decide what to do about the pregnancy." What do you mean by that? What can I do with it? Well, maybe it's not the right time for a baby. I'm guessing you don't have much time left. So no, Nancy interrupted sharply, realizing what he was getting at. No, darling, whatever it is, I don't intend to get rid of our child. We're going to raise him well anyway. Charles agreed obediently. But keep in mind that I may soon be left with literally nothing. And now, I'm not even sure I can get a decent job fast enough. But how could I? Nancy shook her hands. Everything was fine when we left, wasn't it? Or did you just not want to upset me then? No, you've got it right, haven't you? Things were really good and great back then. I don't know how that could have happened. And in just a month, it's a total nightmare. I won't bore you with the details, but there's been some weird tax fraud. And a bunch of other irregularities. I can assure you, I didn't know anything about it. And now I'm trying to find out who did it, and if there's anything I can do about it. Yeah, Nancy sighed. I should probably do something to catalyze my job search. Don't get me wrong, I trust you. But from what you're saying, I don't take offense. Honey, you're absolutely right. You may have to be the one to provide for our family for a while. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. No, you're not. It's what I envisioned. I understand, honey, but we're a family, and we have to work through things together. You remember for better or for worse. Of course I remember. Charles smiled. But no matter how hard the man tried, he couldn't do it. According to his own apt expression with his bare hands, to stop a snow avalanche, the prosperous business that his family had built for generations collapsed almost in an instant. But even that wasn't the worst of it. Charles never managed to find out who exactly inside the firm was involved in various money frauds. And all the formal strings, of course, led back to him as the business owner. So he was threatened with a considerable prison term under the criminal article. And to avoid this, it was necessary to pay off the numerous debts in which his company was mired. Charles had no choice but to sell the apartment. Nancy told him without a moment's hesitation that since there were no other options, it had to be done as soon as possible. But where would we live? In despair, exclaimed her husband. Where to live? You and I will figure it out. She answered decisively. But what will I do if you go to prison for the rest of your life? I can't even imagine. Here to the rescue of the young family came Molly, who offered her son and daughter-in-law to move to her in the village. My house is a big place. There's enough for everyone, she said. So let's not have any of your objections. You'll be my helpers again. It's a big farm. And I'm not young. I could use an extra hand. And when you get back on your feet, you'll move back to town. If you want to, of course. The young people had no choice but to agree to the proposal. By then, Nancy was long past the point of no work. She hadn't been able to find anything until her belly became too obvious. After that, of course, it would have been foolish to try. No employer would want a pregnant woman, and even late in the pregnancy, on their staff. As for Charles, he came to his senses pretty quickly. He had no time to write. His wife depended on him, their future, the child that was about to be born. A month after the disaster, he found himself a job. Of course, not at the same level as before, as a manager in some small firm. Hopefully, a little more sweat later, looking for something better. I had to go to work, of course, from Molly's village to the city. It wasn't a long way. But that fact couldn't stop Charles. After all, a vegetable garden is a vegetable garden, but you can't eat vegetables alone. And he was simply ashamed to sit on his mother's neck, though she would hardly have minded if he had spent some more time looking for something. Nancy, not wanting to sit idle, actively helped her mother-in-law in the household. Of course, the tasks she was given were not the most difficult, the kind that could not harm her or the future child. She also regularly traveled to the city, despite the long road, which every day became harder to bear. But the woman rightly reasoned that to refuse to see a doctor regularly, even under these conditions, would do more harm than good. Then little Kelly was born. To Nancy's surprise, Molly was in no hurry to take any part in her granddaughter's life. Of course, the woman didn't expect any help from her mother-in-law. After all, she had helped them out enough as it was, so she had every right to rest. After all, she had already canceled her diapers when she was fiddling with little Bones. Nancy was amazed. What Molly was showing to Kelly was complete indifference. Didn't want to play with her, or even just look at the little girl. Of course, she didn't mention it, not to her mother-in-law, not to her husband. Things happen. Maybe the poor woman was so tired of their presence that she no longer wanted anything. But time went on, and they continued to live in Molly's village house, and neither Charles nor Nancy could find work. For the first 3 years, though, she didn't have time to do it. And time was not playing on her side. Now, in addition to a dubious departure from her previous job, she has a gaping hole in her employment record of almost 5 years. And a small child in her arms did not add to her employer's favor. Charles, on the other hand, remained a simple manager. He could not get a more prestigious position. After all, he was the owner of the company, which had prospered for many years, and under him scandalously ceased to exist. Of course, inside the company where he got a job, his talents were appreciated, but there were simply no opportunities for him to be promoted. Yeah, don't worry, Molly told them. Stay with me as long as you need, for the rest of your life. I know it's a difficult situation, and they're not strangers. They're human beings, and they lived. What else could they do? And, in general, they lived quite well in the fresh air, in a good house with fresh vegetables, grown with their own hands. They had enough money for everything they needed, and the landlady seemed to be only happy to have them in her possession. The only thing that every year more and more worried Nancy was rapidly approaching the time when Kelly would have to go to school. Of course, it was good for a child to live in the fresh air, so to speak, in harmony with nature. But to get up at 5 o'clock and go to the city for a lesson is not very convenient. In the village, there were simply no educational institutions. However, no matter how it was, there was still enough time to think of a way out of this situation. In the meantime, you could live in peace and enjoy your happiness. After all, by and large, everything was fine. She and Charles, as promised to each other on the wedding day, together overcame a difficult period, and now together entered a joyful and carefree. The trouble came completely out of the blue. They were celebrating Kelly's 4th birthday. As always, just the 3 of them. Molly, as it always happens, refused to attend the party, referring to some urgent matters. The couple had long ago stopped paying attention to this quirk of hers. She wasn't very young after all, and she was entitled to her little oddities. Right at the party table, Charles began to feel sick. First, he began to breathe heavily, and just a few minutes later, he fell to the floor. grabbing life by the chest. Frightened, Nancy immediately called an ambulance, and the long minutes of waiting dragged on. It was not until 200 hours later that paramedics were able to reach their backwoods home. They looked at Charles and were talking excitedly amongst themselves. They began loading him onto a stretcher. No one paid much attention to Nancy, as if she wasn't even here. The ambulance workers showed some reaction only when she took her daughter in her arms and started to climb into their car. "So, lady, where are you going?" One of them asked sternly. "I'm the wife of your patient, and I'm going to the hospital with my husband." "Oh, okay. But why bring the child with you? What's a little girl gonna do in the ICU? Watch her daddy die." "What do you mean, dying?" "Literally, he's having a heart attack. And it's been too long since the attack. We're gonna do everything we can. But I'm not gonna get your hopes up. He probably won't even make it to the hospital." Nancy froze and didn't realize that the ambulance had already left. The doctor's words just drowned her out. She felt as if she had been hit on the head with a very heavy object. How is it a heart attack? How is that dying? What the hell is this? Aren't there too many deaths around her for that very reason? And how will she live without her Charles? Molly, to her surprise, reacted quite calmly to her son's condition, and even to the words of the doctor, who could hear as well as Nancy. As soon as the car left, she calmly went on with her vegetable garden chores. As if nothing had happened, she just said something in passing. "What can you do? It's hereditary. His father also died early and, alas, of the same disease. You probably know that yourself. But he's your son." Nancy couldn't stand it. "How can you be so calm? Do I have to lie down and die too?" shouted the mother-in-law. "Is there anything I can do about it?" "I don't think so. So why worry for nothing?" Nancy, startled by her words, went back into the house. She didn't know what to do. To go into town. But she hadn't even been told which hospital Charles was being taken to. Not that there were very many in their little town, but to run to all of them, and with a baby. I mean, even now, it's unlikely her grandmother would even agree to look after Kelly. It's not the smartest thing to do. But she couldn't just sit around waiting for something to happen. In the end, all she could do was pace the room, feverishly thinking about what to do, how to help Charles, and how she would live if she couldn't help him. She was unceremoniously interrupted by a phone call, which was probably the 100th time she had thought about it, but had not yielded any results. With trembling hands, Nancy picked up the phone, and before answering it for a while, just stared at it. She had already guessed what she was about to hear, and it was as if she were trying to delay the inevitable, but of course she couldn't delay it for too long. "Hello? Hello? Nancy." "Yes," she answered in a shaky voice. "It's me." "Nancy, you have a call from the 3rd City Hospital. Is it about your husband? I'm authorized to inform you that the doctors did everything possible to resuscitate him. Unfortunately, despite our best efforts, your husband passed away. I'm sorry for your loss." Nancy had absolutely no recollection of her time. The next hour, I think she sobbed, rolled around on the floor, and almost banged her head against the walls. And it seemed that her own life had ended along with Charles's, that there was no point in her continuing to be in this world. And there's no telling how long it would have lasted or how it would have ended if it hadn't been for Kelly. Scared. The little girl had absolutely no idea what was going on. They were sitting around, celebrating her birthday, and everything was just fine. And then in an instant, everything fell apart. First, something happened to her dad, and now her mom went crazy. For a long time, she hoped all this madness would just go away. But Mommy kept rolling around on the floor and crying bitterly, and little Kelly had no choice but to join her. The sounds her daughter began to make brought Nancy to her senses rather quickly. She sat down on the floor, not exactly calmly, but at least already quite aware of what she was doing, and pressed Kelly against her, albeit briefly, but still she had forgotten even about her, and now she felt guilty. No, this was her raison d'etre. She may no longer have a husband, But she still had a child she was responsible for. Aha, you've calmed down at last, Molly grumbled. Molly quietly appeared in the room and said to Nancy, I must tell you, Lord, how did Charles die? The woman replied indifferently, Yes, I'm following in your footsteps. I told you I wasn't going to waste my energy worrying about it. Nancy made no reply. She could not understand how one could be so calm about the unexpected death of one's own child. Could it be some kind of defense mechanism? Maybe the mother-in-law had not yet fully realized what had happened. Everyone reacts differently to such shocks. She can't really feel nothing. Oh, by the way, Molly, meanwhile, now that you're awake, let's start packing. What do you mean? I don't get it, Nancy. What do you mean? What? You don't think I'd let a stranger stay in my house, do you? You were my son's wife. I'm nobody, and I don't see any reason to keep you here any longer. This shocked Nancy even more. It was exactly the sort of thing she'd been trying to avoid for the rest of her life, and it was exactly what she had finally arrived at. And all of a sudden it occurred to her that it must be a birth curse or something. Otherwise, how else to explain that now she had to repeat her mother's fate? But let's say I'm a stranger to you. Though all the years we've known each other, I've been sure of the opposite, she said, trying to keep her voice calm. But Kelly is Kelly. After all, she is your granddaughter, the daughter of your only son, who is no longer alive. And I'd already told you that I don't like children, and I'm not going to take care of them. I don't want your Kelly here. But where are we going? You know very well I have no home, no job, no relatives. Well, my dear, you should have thought of that before. Why should it suddenly become my problem? Nancy didn't know what to say to that. She had already realized that appealing to this woman's candid feelings was an absolutely useless venture. All this time, she had been hiding her true nature behind a mask of benevolence and friendliness. But now the need to pretend was completely gone. She looked at both the woman who had just lost her husband and her daughter, who was her own granddaughter, with a completely blank stare. Well, all right. Molly suddenly softened. We have an old barn on our property. We lived in it when there was no house. It's cramped, of course, but there's a bed and a stove. It's just enough to get by. You can occupy it for now, but don't let me see you in the house. In fact, don't try to see me too often. Thank you, said Nancy. It wasn't much of an option, of course, but it was better than going out on the street with her daughter. Thanks. You won't get fed up, Molly said, considering this shed you're renting from me. Yeah. Don't interrupt. I know you don't have any money. You'll do all the work in the summer, chop wood in the winter. You'll do all the little errands. For that, you can live in the barn and take a small share of the harvest. All right, Nancy agreed. She couldn't see any other way out. It would be easier if she were alone. But she was also responsible for her daughter, so she couldn't just proudly raise her head and walk away into the unknown. So at least the child would be in the relative warmth of safety and nourishment. And so it was that she and her entourage began to live in that very shirt. Nancy thought that the hardest thing to explain to her daughter would be what had happened. Why did they have to move from a spacious house to this squalid one? Where was her father? And why they would never see him again? However, to the woman's surprise, the girl herself started this difficult conversation, showing herself beyond her years, wise and understanding. Mom, she asked, when they were settling into their new place of residence. Dad's dead. We won't see him again. I'm afraid so, Sunshine, Nancy replied. It's just you and me now. Then said the girl seriously, I'm going to take care of you now. Daddy always said that if anything happened to him, I'd have to take care of it. Ah, dumbfounded, thought Nancy. How could you know something and not tell me? But you did try to prepare the child somehow. Well, perhaps that was the right thing to do. At first, the woman hoped this existence wouldn't last too long for them. She would get a job, not as a saleswoman, but as a cleaner, and she and her daughter would be able to return to the city, yes, again in some rented room. And what to do? After all, she'd lived like that with her mother, and nothing too bad had happened. However, the more time passed, the more it became clear that it was impossible. Called on her household work took away both time and energy. It became obvious that under such conditions she would not even be able to look for a job. But if not to fulfill the terms of the contract, she and her child would simply end up on the street. A completely hopeless situation. Gradually, Nancy came to terms with the idea of living. This is how they will have a few more years until her daughter grows up a little and will be able to help her in the household. Of course, it would be bad to exploit the child in this way, but it would give her at least a chance to find a job and return to the city. At the same time, the woman began to prepare Kelly for school, although she didn't really see how that would be possible. At the very least, she was ready to teach her herself, although this option seemed to be the worst of all possible. After all, she didn't know as much as she should, and she wanted to give her daughter a better education than she had received, so that at least she would not repeat the unenviable fate of her older relatives. For now, Nancy slowly taught her daughter to read, count, and write. To her surprise and joy, Kelly turned out to be a very imaginative child and grasped everything literally on the fly. By the time she was 5, she was already able to read syllables and print letters and do simple math calculations. The latter, it seems, was very fascinating to the girl herself. So a little over a year passed. Nancy was still trying to make some plans to return to normal life, but every day they seemed less and less realistic. She was beginning to think that there was no way out of the vicious circle in which she and her daughter found themselves. But help found them, coming from a direction from which no one could expect it. It was shortly after Kelly's birthday. It was late at night, and the girl had long been sleeping peacefully in her bed. Only Nancy had no time for sleep. In the dim light of the kerosene lamp, she looked at the photograph of her late husband and cried softly so as not to wake her daughter. From the moment they had been forced to live in that barn, it had become a kind of daily routine for her. More accurately, a nightly ritual. During the day, she had to be strong, had to work, and take care of her daughter. She had no time to grieve for Charles. But at night, she could afford to grieve enough. And on one such night, something strange came to Nancy's sensitive ears, like the creaking of a new wicket gate, not somewhere far away, but on their property. It alarmed the woman. She knew for a fact that Molly never went out at this hour, and she never had visitors. So what was it? Did thieves break in? The landlady must have heard the sound too. There was an answering creak from the side of the house. Then a loud yell from Molly, wondering who it was that was walking and what they wanted on her property. She was answered by another voice that sounded vaguely familiar to Nancy. What exactly he said the woman did not hear, but it clearly did not please her mother-in-law, who delivered a rather long and vehement monologue. The second voice answered her with no less emotional phrase. A verbal altercation ensued. Nancy sat behind Merzav, not knowing what to do, whether to go out and try to figure out what was going on, or, on the contrary, to sit quietly and keep her head down. In any case, whatever was going on outside, it looked little like a robbery or any other criminal act. It didn't make it any clearer, however, whether the acoustics in the barn made it worthwhile to intervene in the unfolding conflict. Nancy couldn't even begin to understand what it was about. While she was thinking, however, the problem resolved itself. There was the creak of the door again, this time very close. Someone had entered her barn, and she had no time to realize it. When in the faint light of the lamp she saw a face, Nancy stared and could not believe her eyes. Standing on the threshold of her humble abode was an elderly woman she recognized without a doubt, though she hadn't seen her in years. Now it was clear why the voice of the uninvited guests seemed so familiar to her. Of course it did. She had heard it more than once or twice, and it was with such cruel and accusing intonations. "Grandmother." It was all she could manage to say before she fainted. Woke up. Nancy was still in the same barn, and she didn't even immediately remember what exactly had happened. It seemed to her that she had simply not noticed how she had fallen asleep, sitting habitually on the bed with a picture of her late husband. Soon enough, however, her memory brought back the image of her grandmother standing in the doorway of her home. However, and this she took for the first minute to be either a dream or a play of her sick imagination. But as soon as she turned her head slightly, it became clear that everything that had happened was real. Her grandmother was sitting on the next bed, holding little Kelly, who was her great-granddaughter. She was talking affectionately to the girl about something, and the girl, not expressing any sign of fright, was telling her passionately about something. Nancy provoked the grandmother, noticing the stirring on the neighboring bed, woke up. "Oh, that's good. See, Kelly, Mommy's okay. Were you scared?" "She had every reason to be," replied Nancy coldly. "Daughter, didn't I tell you not to talk to strangers?" "But Lisa said she wasn't a stranger," the girl retorted. Nancy stared at her dumbfounded at first, and then laughed half at the ridiculousness of the situation, half letting out her nervous tension. Still, she sometimes forgot that her daughter was beyond bright. But she was still a 5-year-old child with all the consequences of this fact. "And what bombed not from us?" she asked. "Calm down. Nancy, I realize that you have every reason to be both angry with me and distrustful of me. However, you have to realize that I changed." "No, I guess I haven't." "That's not even the point. I haven't changed. It's the circumstances. And now I really want to make it up to you. You don't know me at all. And neither do I. The last time I saw you, I was the same age as Veda is now. Then I remember you called me that and wanted nothing to do with me." "That's true?" Kelly asked sternly, glancing at her great-grandmother. "I'm afraid so, penitent sunshine," replied the latter. "Then don't do it again," said the girl. "I won't." "My good," Lisa said. "How did you even know where to find me, by the way?" asked Nancy. "Well, it wasn't too hard, I suppose. I'm a relative after all, so I was very willing to share information. You were married to a well-known businessman in town. They wrote about you in the newspapers about how he went bankrupt, sold his apartment, and went to his mother's house in the country. I asked around your former neighbors. That's how I found out what kind of village it was. But here, too, you had to go around a few houses in the middle of the night." Nancy clarified skeptically. "Yes, they weren't happy about it, but they pointed out the right house in the end. I had planned to arrive at a more appropriate time, but I didn't expect the road to be so terrible. I don't like driving anyway. I had to go at the speed of a bicycle on your off-road course." "So you're driving a car?" Nancy was amazed. "Not on foot," grumbled Lisa. "You wouldn't be able to get here otherwise. At my age. And I'm still quite capable of driving." "Well, let's say you are." Nancy sighed heavily. "So why did you come anyway? What had to happen for you to suddenly remember I existed?" "I came to see how you were doing. I didn't expect it to be this bad. I guess you've had a bad luck with your mother-in-law. Just like your poor mother." "Oh my God. It's exactly the same situation. It's exactly the same. So now I think you and Kelly should get out of here. You shouldn't have to live in such an abominable environment." "Why would you care?" Nancy couldn't take it anymore, so she raised her voice. "You said yourself that my mother had the same situation with you that I did. You hated her as much as you hated me. Did you have a guilty conscience in your old age?" Quietly, Lisa whispered angrily, "Kelly's asleep. No wonder. There's no time. I'll explain it to you in a minute, and it has nothing to do with conscience, believe me. At least not my poem," to Nancy's skeptical eye. She took a deep breath and corrected herself. "No, of course I'm guilty before you. And whatever your mother's sins, real or imaginary, you're not responsible for her. Besides, she really is my own granddaughter. After my son died, I had no one else. And I treated you like this. What sins of my mother's are you talking about?" Nancy was indignant. "As far as I know, she tried to find a common language with you to the very last. It was you who disliked her from the very first time you met her. She didn't seem to me to be a good match for my son," Lisa confessed. "But I think I could have accepted her in time. but I didn't have the chance to get to know her better. I must have missed that first impression, since I could so easily believe all the anonymity with which she was smitten," Nancy asked. "Yes, different people have sent me notes of pictures that say, 'Your mother is cheating on my son,' and then that it's not really his daughter. They wrote that she was with him only because of her apartment, then she didn't have one, and then even worse, as if she had deliberately decided to kill him so that everything he had would remain only for her. That's when I persuaded him to sign the apartment over to me, like if something really happened to him so she wouldn't get it, and he agreed. I was sure nothing was going to happen to him anytime soon. And then, as you know, he died young. He had a heart attack, you know. It must have been so hard for me to believe. And then, after all those letters, I thought it was a sure thing. Your mother poisoned my son. And you believed it. Then I did. I'm telling you, I really didn't like her at first. Now, though, I realize it wasn't even her. It was me. I was too attached to my only child. Like I didn't want to share him with anyone, you know. How can you not believe something that so clearly confirms his own beliefs?" "Well, dumbfounded," Nancy retorted. "But now what made you change your mind after all these years?" "Yes, you see, conscience. Not me, really, but the girl who wrote the notes. She's not a girl now. She's a grown woman, the same age as your mother-in-law and mother. If she were alive, she would have come to me and told me that she had written those letters and that there was not a word of truth in them. She made them up out of her head, and she'd forged the photos somehow. All because she was your father's girlfriend before he met your mom. She loved him madly and couldn't get over the breakup. I don't know what went wrong between them. All I know is that your mom had nothing to do with it. They met a little later. But this girl was literally obsessed with your dad. She was watching him. And of course, when she found out he had a new love, she hated her. But I didn't do anything about it at first. I hoped it wouldn't work out, or that he'd remember. She'd leave your mother, and everything would be fine. But when they decided to get married, that's when, you know, she couldn't take it anymore and decided to act secretly through me. That's the story." Nancy exhaled. "But I'm sorry. I don't think it justifies you. You have to believe someone you don't know, and literally ruin a person's life for it. I'm not talking about me. But my mom died young, and my dad died because she thought he was torn between the two of you." "Yes, Nancy." Lisa sighed again. "You're right. I realize that now. But you can't undo what you've done. And you can't get your parents back. But I can at least try to help you and your little girl. You're the only family I have left. What do you suggest?" "What do you mean?" "What? Come back to the city with me to your parents' apartment. I've been renting it out all this time, but it's empty now. You can live there, especially since it's rightfully yours. I'm even willing to officially sign it over to you, and I'll help you with money for a while. I've got a lot of money saved up over a long life, but they haven't brought me any happiness. Well, I don't know." Nancy stretched out. In her soul, she was struggling with contradictory feelings. On the one hand, the offer looked just fine. Really, the apartment should logically belong to her, and Kelly would be much better off living there. Honestly, she'd probably be better off anywhere than here. Lisa's visit to Nancy was supposed to be her salvation from all her misfortunes. On the other hand, she saw before her not so much an unhappy old and lonely woman as a man who had ruined her whole life, and though indirectly had caused the death of her mother, and perhaps even of her father. It was simply repugnant to accept any help from her, no matter how much she assured her granddaughter of her sincere remorse. There was, however, another consideration that was not at all pleasant. There was not the slightest reason to trust the grandmother who had suddenly announced herself. She might be up to some other mischief. It wasn't very likely, of course, but I couldn't put it out of my mind. "I can understand your reluctance to accept anything from me," Lisa said. "But think of your daughter. She'll be going to school soon. How's she gonna get here every day?" "I'm sorry, Nancy, but this couldn't have come at a better time. Believe me, I'm speaking and acting from the heart, no strings attached. Take it, granddaughter." Nancy looked carefully straight into Lisa's eyes and suddenly realized, even for herself, that she believed her. Some inner instinct told her that the old woman was telling the truth and really wanted to help, or to ease her own soul before her imminent death. After all, at her age, you really don't know which day might be your last. "Okay," Nancy stretched out. "Here's the thing. The morning is wiser in the evening. Come on, let's get to bed. It's getting late. We don't have much room, but I can go with Kelly. Why don't you guys come over here on my bed? We'll figure out what we're gonna do in the morning. You're not going anywhere right now anyway." Lisa agreed. The next morning, they hurriedly packed their things, to Molly's indignant cries. It seemed that the woman had gotten so used to having a free labor that she didn't want to let her go. But alas, there was no real possibility of keeping the woman at her place. On entering the apartment where she had been born and had spent the first years of her life, Nancy experienced mixed feelings. The atmosphere was exactly the same as it had been under her parents, and this novella is a memory of those childhood years, which were still happy. A dad and mom still alive, and how good they all were until everything went downhill. Kelly, who had never seen a city or her own apartment in her life, loved it here. She was genuinely amazed by the simplest things. Hot water giving straight from the faucet to go to the toilet right in the house warmth, without the need to make firewood and stoke the stove. In addition, the girl now had her own desk, where she could both draw and study. Undoubtedly, it was much more comfortable than sitting on the bed, putting under a notebook or album sheet of some kind, and even great-grandmother, having learned about her interest in math, gave her a children's book with many entertaining and puzzle problems. So Kelly was perfectly happy. And Nancy, to be frank, was glad to be back in town, and would have been glad even if the last terrible year had simply not existed. Fresh air was fresh, and yes, and her own vegetables were certainly a good thing. Still, she missed the conveniences of the city, and the stores, and the noisy streets, and all the other hustle and bustle that had no place in the village under any guise. Sometimes it began to seem to Nancy that Lisa had become a real guardian angel to her and little Kelly. Only a month after returning to the city, the woman managed to find a job, and it was as a sales consultant in a clothing store, with a very good salary. And her life slowly began to return to normal. In addition, quite quickly, Nancy became convinced that she could leave Kelly with her grandmother without any fears. The latter did not dote on her great-granddaughter. Or maybe she just spent too much time alone. And she was glad of any company, and at the same time the object of care. And the girl herself became fast friends with Lisa. Nancy's relations with her grandmother were still strained. Whatever she did, no matter how hard she tried, she could not win her granddaughter's favor. The woman herself was not happy about this state of affairs, but she could not help it. The resentment was too strong. The damage done was too great. The only thing she had the nobility to do was not to turn Kelly against Lisa and not to prevent their communication. However, she would not let her grandmother even on the doorstep of her apartment, and brought her daughter to her. And one day there came a moment when they all rejoiced at this behavior of hers. One day, returning from work, Nancy gathered the entourage from Lisa, and they went home together. Barely putting the key in the keyhole, the woman realized something was wrong. The door was not locked, only slightly covered, and not very neatly at that. Nancy knew for a fact that she could not have left it in this condition. She always checked all sorts of things thoroughly before she left, including coming back several times almost halfway across the street to make sure the apartment was perfectly safe. Inside, however, it was chaos. All the drawers were overturned, things from the closets unceremoniously thrown on the floor, even the beds. Even the beds were a horrifying sight. The linens had been stripped from them, and the mattresses had clearly been exposed to some kind of cutting object. It was obvious at a glance that something had been searched, very thoroughly and meticulously. Of course, the first thing Nancy did was to call the police. The law enforcers arrived and carefully examined the crime scene, but did not seem to be able to find any significant clues. They then invited the homeowner to take a look at her belongings and tell them what was missing. That's where the strangest and most frightening thing came to light. Nothing was missing. Not that there were a lot of valuable things in the house, but still potential thieves would have something to gain. However, and silver jewelry, Nancy, and TV, and a laptop, bought for study, found here in the apartment, albeit not in their places, so the perpetrators were not the target. Robbery, concluded one of the police officers. Unless, of course, you had, for example, some documents or other things that might be of interest to a particular person and were not in this apartment. There is nothing like that, Nancy said, confused. Look, I work as a store clerk, and you're implying that my house might contain dangerous dirt. You're a store clerk now, the cop said. You used to be the wife of a prominent businessman. As far as I know, I'm not implying anything, but I had to ask you this question anyway. All right, if you are firmly convinced that nothing of the sort could have been looked for here, I'm sure, immediately, replied Nancy. Good. Then another theory. Maybe you just wanted revenge for something. Do you have any enemies? Maybe someone who has a reason to hold a grudge against you. Unless it's an ex-mother-in-law, Nancy chuckled. But I don't think the old woman would have come all the way from the country to trash my apartment. You know, I've seen so many interesting situations over the years that I wouldn't be surprised if she had. Anyway, until we find out who did this, I wouldn't advise you to stay in this apartment. But where am I going to go? Nancy was indignant. Well, you know, that's not a question for me. The policeman shrugged his shoulders. But since this isn't a robbery, it could be personal. Not a sure thing, of course. But still, it's up to you. But it might not be safe here. After some thought, Nancy decided that it would be better for Kelly to stay with Lisa for a while. She couldn't bring herself to move in with her, even for a while. Even though she didn't mind at all. Even the possible threat to her life did not frighten her, as the prospect of being under the same roof with her own grandmother for a long time. So they lived for another 2 or 3 weeks. The police promised to call as soon as they knew something, but they never heard from them again. Fortunately, there were no new frightening incidents either. Nancy was even beginning to think that if all was quiet, she might as well take her daughter back home. Sure, she came to see her every day, but she still couldn't be completely calm when Kelly wasn't home at night. After all, if suddenly someone was actually looking for some specific documents, assuming Nancy might have them, what was to stop them from breaking into Lisa's place? For example, figuring she might have hidden them at her grandmother's. And to Nancy's surprise, it turned out soon enough that she wasn't too far from the truth. The compromise that was apparently being sought in their apartment was not even Lisa's, but Kelly's, who, of course, had no idea about it. And it turned out at the moment, when among her notebooks, brought from the village, the girl found a memory card. The kind that are usually inserted into cell phones. Fortunately, she didn't throw it away or try to look at the information it contained. Instead, she showed it to Lisa. The woman, after a moment's hesitation, contacted Nancy. An hour later, the woman was driving home with the memory card in her purse. Some premonition told her that it was this small black rectangle that had caused the mayhem in her apartment. Before she reported her find to the police, however, she decided it was worth taking a look at its contents for herself. What if there is some innocent video of a corporate party? Or an archive of photos of her beloved dead cat Molly? Or maybe the card was empty. Strictly speaking, Nancy had expected to see absolutely anything, up to and including a detailed videotape of some horrible crime being committed. But she wasn't prepared for what was actually on the memory card. After a quick look through all the files, she rushed to call the police again. After listening to her, the officer on duty assured her that he would send officers immediately. However, they had to go not to Nancy's house, but to the village where Molly lived. Besides the fact that the police now had evidence that she had committed a serious crime, they also had every reason to fear for her own life, and they were just in time. When they pulled up, some suspicious type had already finished pouring gasoline on it, and was now about to set it on fire with the landlady, sleeping peacefully inside. A few days later, one of the policemen arrived at Nancy's house, where little Kelly had already returned. As it turned out, it was the same one who had arrived on her first call. Now, however, he had an extra star on each of his epaulets. Here, he said, right from the doorstep, he came to express his official gratitude to you. Thanks to you, we have caught an extremely dangerous gang, which we have been hunting for decades and unofficially. What was that for? Because again, thanks to you, I was in charge of the operation. And as you may have noticed, I got an additional rank for it. No way. It's basically a pure coincidence. What does that have to do with me? Maybe so, but still, what if it wasn't an accident? Oh, come on. Anyway, I think you'd like to know some details about this case. I can help you with that. Of course, it's within the limits of what I can tell you not to harm the investigation. But it just so happens that I already know some things, Nancy remarked. For instance, that it was my mother-in-law who killed her husband, and then mine, in conspiracy with some bandits. I didn't quite understand why it took her so long to do it, though. Slow-acting poison, the policeman explained. But a very trustworthy man dies of what looks like a heart attack. There's no way to trace it. The substance is eliminated from the body very quickly, virtually undetectable. If it wasn't for this tape, we'd never know the truth. That's right. Why would she keep it in the barn where she sent me and my daughter to live? I mean, any one of us could have accidentally found it, which is exactly what happened. Well, she kept it as protection from her own accomplices. She couldn't have survived this long without it. They tried to kill her right after they found out she didn't have it. Yeah, it was stupid of her to report them missing. Panicked. Besides, she had no other options. Someone to send to your apartment to try and find her. Although you're right, it would have been better for her to stay put either way, having discovered it missing. If it hadn't been for the mayhem in your apartment, you might not have even noticed that memory card. And as for your second question, she didn't keep it hidden in some old notebook. And then, when she gave it to your daughter, she mixed it up, discovered it. By the way, right on the day you left her, but never found a way to discreetly change the notebooks back. So that's what she was so excited about that day, Nancy realized. Well, that much is clear, but the rest is still a mystery to me. What kind of person would kill their own son? What could possibly be the reasons for such an act? But first of all, Charles was not her son. Yeah, don't look so surprised. In fact, he probably didn't even know it himself. His real mother died when he was very young, and his father took Molly in, first as a nanny for the boy, and then married her. As I recall, your husband was assured all his adult life that this woman was his real mother, but even so, I still don't understand. She raised him, fed him, educated him, was so nice to him. You know, I honestly don't get it either. Well, on an emotional level, I guess her hatred for his whole family was too great. Well, that's just gonna confuse the two of us. Let me tell you the whole story from the beginning. And if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them. You're right, Nancy nodded. That would be most convenient. Well then, it all began, perhaps, when Molly was not even alive. But there was her father, a young but promising businessman who shared everything with an old school friend. As you may have guessed, with the father of her future husband. These two, as far as I understood, were inseparable since childhood, went to the same group of kindergarten, then got into the same class. They went to university together in high school. They graduated together and started a small business together. Their business prospered. However, at some point, one of the partners began to notice some oddities, that somewhere the balance does not add up, or something else. At first, it was small things, but then the violations became more and more serious. It was already becoming dangerous for the whole business, and the owner could not find the one who was to blame. He had already checked the accountant and all the staff, even those who, it would seem, could not have access to such serious things. There's no way. To appeal to the competent authorities. Naturally, He didn't want to, so as not to incur suspicion on himself. In general, as I understand it, he was going to quietly, without making a fuss, fire the culprit of all these problems, somehow deal with the violations, and quietly move on with his life. However, the further he dug, the more he realized that only one person could do such a thing: his business partner and, consequently, Molly's father. She herself was still in high school at the time. Of course, the owner of the firm for a long time did not want to believe it, but eventually realized that the evidence is irrefutable. Then he came to his friend with a business proposition. He fixes everything he has done, returns the stolen money, and voluntarily leaves the firm. For what reasons? Let him think of his own. But from that moment their paths diverge, and they have no further dealings with each other. It would seem to be an ideal option for a dishonest partner. But he blows up, saying it's as much my business as it is yours. And since that's how you feel about me, why don't you and I just split it fair and square? We built it together, and now you'll get all the good stuff. Anyway, they couldn't reach a peaceful agreement. And then the honest partner went to the police and ratted out Molly's dad. He ended up keeping the business, although he had to sweat a lot to bring it back to its former level of development. And his friend went to prison, and for a long time. He died for a long time, born with some not too pleasant disease. His wife could not bear the loss of her husband and soon followed him, and their 15-year-old daughter went to an orphanage. It is clear that she started a grudge, considering her father's former friend to be to blame for all her troubles. She didn't manage to get a proper education, nothing at all. All her parents' property was sold off for their debts. The only thing left was a plot of land in the village, which their family used to use as a summer house, and even that played against Molly, so that she could count on at least some apartment from the state. But with this plot and house, it turned out that even this she is not entitled to, because any but housing she has. In general, she left the orphanage angry at the whole world, but most of all at her father's old friend. Lived in the village, interrupted by casual earnings, until one day she saw an ad in the newspaper that a little boy who had lost his mother needed a nanny. Of course, she had no desire to sit with the infant, but when she saw the name of the employer, she realized this was her chance for revenge. She had a lot of patience, and she waited first for the wedding, and then for the boy to grow up, and a little into the management of the business, so that when his father died, the business would definitely go to him and not to someone else. But why go to all this trouble? Nancy wondered. Up to this moment she had served with bated breath. Yes, because she would hardly have been able to ruin the business with her husband alive. And that's exactly what she wanted. I think murder just seemed too small for her. Not enough to satisfy her thirst for revenge. She wanted someone from her abuser's family to experience the hardships she had to endure. So she's the one who ruined the suit, the business. Yeah, well, I'd have to say you were her unwitting accomplice. Charles was very attracted to you, and therefore began to pay less time to work affairs, and then even left for a month on a wedding trip, which gave her full freedom of action. But that was later. First, she took out his father. In fact, that's where the gang shows up in the story. What were we so successful in picking up the other day? We haven't figured out exactly how she got in touch with these people, but they gave her a way to commit the crime, and they sold her the poison. That was their primary function. Let's say Nancy wrinkles her brow, but I still don't get it. She ruined the business. We had to sell the apartment and move in with her. You'd think that's what she was after. Why kill Charles too? It was her plan to destroy the whole family. Besides, she couldn't have been too pleased to have you living in her house, and there was no way to evict you while he was alive. He could have tried to start a new business. He might have succeeded, and then everything would have been ruined. All her plans and her hopes. Nancy, are you all right? The woman gasped, covered her mouth with her hand. My back was against the wall I was standing against. The policeman helped her to the couch and sat down, poured water, and only after drinking it was she able to speak. You said she wanted to destroy the whole family. Then I'm afraid she did. She didn't put you in the barn out of some twisted pity. She targeted your daughter, the last member of a hated family, as her next victim. Who knows what would have happened if your grandmother had been so fortunate as not to remember your existence? Yes, Nancy muttered, and now everything was falling into place. Well, thank you very much for the information. I'm not sure I needed it so badly, though. Well, philosophized the policeman. It would have come to you sooner or later anyway. After all, if you didn't know the details, you'd look for them, and you'd still hear them at the trial. He left, and Nancy spent a long time trying to come to her senses and digest what she had just learned. She thought of the incredible twists and turns she could make in life. And now it turned out that her kind and cheerful mother-in-law turned out to be a real monster. And her grandmother, who she'd spent her whole life thinking was the worst person in the world. Turns out she saved her daughter, even if she didn't know it. The thought turned Nancy's mind upside down. She realized that she no longer felt the disgust she had for Lena. Only now did she truly feel grateful to her for pulling her and Kelly out of the nightmare they had lived in for a year. The very next day, she showed up at her grandmother's house with flowers and a cake. The women talked for a long time and cried a lot. In the end, they sat up so late that Nancy and Kelly had to spend the night at Lisa's house, and for the first time, the thought didn't cause her granddaughter's soul any repulsion. The following year, Kelly went to school. Not an easy one. Lisa hustled to get her accepted into a math grammar school. There her abilities quickly appreciated at face value and began to prophesize her great future. The girl studied very well. And no one was surprised by the fact that after 11 years, she decided to leave to enter one of the prestigious universities in the capital. True, Lisa, who was one of the first to notice the talent of her great-granddaughter, did not live to see this happy moment. She passed away shortly after Kelly went to the first grade, after spending very little time with her newfound family again. This came as a major blow to Nancy, although in her mind, she knew it was coming. I'd lived a good life, Lisa said shortly before she died. And at the end of it, I managed to do some real good. What are you saying, Grandma? Nancy was outraged at the time. At what end do you have to send your branch to university and then get married? Oh, my dear, I don't think I'll have time to marry you either, let alone a branch. But it's okay. Don't get upset. I'm already very old, and I'm really glad that I'll die knowing that I've received your forgiveness. The old woman's words proved prophetic. Nancy had indeed remarried, but Nana was indeed not destined to see it. The meeting with her second spouse took place a few years after she was buried. Surprisingly, it happened almost exactly the same way as the first time. A man whose car ran into the store where Nancy worked for new pants. He wasn't a businessman though, just a delivery man. And the store was no longer a boutique, but a cheap establishment. Why do you need new pants? Nancy wondered, listening to his confused explanation. How am I going to show up like this to a customer? He wondered. It's at least a fine. And if it turns out to be very scandalous, so and even dismissal, it's not a big stain. Smirked the woman with hysteria in the toilet on the second floor. That's all. That's what he did. 2 weeks later, he showed up at the store again. It was Nancy's shift. Don't tell me. Half joking, half wary, she said, that now you've spilled coffee on your jacket. Honestly, that was the idea. The man smirked, but I decided to dispense with those cheap excuses. The thing is, I really like you. Let me ask you out on a date. My name is Charles, by the way. At this point, the woman almost fainted. For the second time in her life, but she did go on a date. This time, the relationship had no negative impact on her work. In addition, the new suitor was approved by the most important censor, Lisa, so 6 months later they got married. A year later, Nancy's daughter had a baby brother.